There are moments in history when a single quiet mind reads the world so clearly that entire empires tilt beneath the weight of its insight. Long before the skyscrapers of our financial districts cast their steel shadows across the morning streets, before traders shouted numbers that could move nations, before modern CEOs staged their battles in boardrooms and on earnings calls, there was a strategist who understood the nature of conflict so profoundly that his ideas would outlive the kingdoms he served. His name was Sun Tzu, and though centuries have weathered the pages of his teachings, the pulse of his wisdom still beats beneath every negotiation, every competition, every silent maneuver in the world of wealth. Tonight, as the fire crackles softly beside us, you and I will step into a realm where war is not merely swords and armor, but patterns, timing, perception, and the art of remaining unseen. We will travel through deserts and along ancient riverbanks. We will stand beside forgotten generals whose names have been brushed into the margins of history. We will listen to the whispers of merchants, spies, tacticians, and kings who mastered the hidden mechanics of advantage. And as their stories unfold, something deeper will stir. You will begin to sense how battles, both ancient and modern, share the same pulse of fear and ambition, the same trembling uncertainty before the strike, the same quiet brilliance that separates the prepared from the destroyed. If the stories you are about to hear resonate with you, if they awaken a hunger for mastery over your own life and fortune, consider supporting the journey. Like the video, subscribe to the Echoes of Wealth channel, or donate if you wish to keep these long, contemplative stories alive. Your presence here is already a form of alliance. Sit closer to the fire. Let the warmth settle into your hands, and listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is something most people never realize until they have already lost years of their life fighting battles they never understood. You are in a war, not a loud one, not the kind sung by poets or carved into stone, but a quiet, elegant war woven into the fabric of every choice you make. It is a war of information, of positioning, of unseen moves and silent defeats. You step into it each morning when you check your bank balance, or when you walk into a workplace where someone else controls your time, or when you dream at night of a life where decisions are your own. Sun Tzu would say that you are a general without realizing it, already on the battlefield without armor, already negotiating with forces you cannot see. There is a story known among certain scholars of the Song dynasty, a tale rarely told outside the circles of archivists and historians. It speaks of a collection of handwritten commentaries known as the Jade Stratagem Notes, penned not by soldiers, but by merchants who found Sun Tzu's words more powerful than any blade. These merchants controlled the caravans that carried tea across the mountains, the salt fleets traveling the Grand Canal, the silk passing through narrow mountain passes guarded by hungry bandits. They understood something profound. The battlefield was not only where blood was shed. The battlefield was where advantage was created. Information was the horse, timing was the weapon, and disguise was the shield. One merchant recorded an unusual observation. He noted that the most dangerous enemy was not the warlord with an army, but the competitor who watched you quietly, studied your habits, and learned your rhythm. You lose not when you are weak, but when you become predictable. These notes were nearly lost when the Imperial Library burned during the Jin invasion, yet fragments survived, carried away in the sleeves of fleeing scribes. And though their authors vanished into the dust of time, the ideas within them drifted across centuries, resurfacing whenever a clever mind was patient enough to hear their whisper. If you listen long enough, you begin to recognize the pattern. The companies that collapse, the investors who panic at exactly the wrong moment, the people who feel trapped in lives they never chose, all of them lose their battles before those battles ever reach them. Sun Tzu wrote that invincibility lies in defense and victory lies in opportunity. He meant that wealth, freedom, and power come from two quiet disciplines. The first is shielding yourself from predictable ruin. The second is learning to see openings long before others recognize their shape. Tonight, we begin charting those openings. You will meet generals whose mistakes became warnings, merchants whose silence became their strength, strategists whose victories unfolded before a single arrow was drawn. And you will see how every principle of ancient warfare has a shadow twin in the financial world you walk through each day. There are hostile takeovers that resemble ambush tactics on mountain roads. There are price wars born from the same arrogance that toppled kings. There are fortunes preserved through the simple discipline of staying unreadable. As the fire stirs and its embers glow brighter, imagine Sun Tzu himself seated across from you, the lines of his face shaped by patience and solitude. Imagine him watching you, not judging, merely waiting for you to understand the lesson he planted centuries ago. Victory belongs to the one who sees clearly. Loss belongs to the one who moves blindly. And in the realm of wealth, blindness is not an accident. It is a habit. This is the prologue to your awakening as a strategist of your own life. A mind capable of quiet wins. A presence that moves like water. A person who does not fight unless the victory was decided long before the first step. If you have ever walked into a room and felt the subtle shift of attention when someone else entered, you have already experienced the first law of strategy. Power announces itself long before words are spoken. In the courts of ancient China, this was called the presence of command, a quiet force that made generals kneel without instruction. Modern people think power comes from money, reputation, or position, but those are only the outer garments of influence. The true substance lies in clarity. The world bends more easily for the person who knows exactly what they are doing and why. Sun Tzu observed that battles are often lost by those who move because they feel they must, rather than because they understand the terrain. I once read a peculiar anecdote recorded in a dusty Japanese commentary on the art of war. It described a minor scholar from the Yuan dynasty who visited a remote monastery in the Zhejiang Mountains. There, he found an elderly monk reading a copy of Sun Tzu's work that had been annotated by military captains who died centuries earlier. The margins were filled with warnings, not commands. The generals had written notes such as, "Do not step where you cannot hear your own breath," and "Beware the familiar path, for it teaches your enemy your gait." These were not instructions for combat alone. They were warnings against drifting through life so predictably that others could anticipate your downfall before you saw it coming. In the financial world, this same pattern repeats itself like a whisper caught between the pages of time. People live by habits they never question. They spend because others spend. They invest because someone on a screen told them to. They follow trends not because they understand them, but because standing still feels like a confession of ignorance. The result is a kind of silent surrender. A surrender to impulse. A surrender to noise. A surrender to a world that knows how to profit from the unfocused. There is another story buried deep within Song Dynasty archives, a tale most historians gloss over because it seems too small to matter. But strategy often hides in small details. A lesser-known tea merchant named Wenjia operated dozens of caravans across narrow mountain roads. Unlike his competitors, he never printed his schedules, never revealed his routes, never allowed his workers to know more than a fragment of the journey. His rivals laughed at him. They said he was paranoid, overly suspicious, perhaps even superstitious. But within a decade, every merchant who mocked him suffered catastrophic losses to bandits and sabotage. Wenjia alone prospered. He was summoned before a provincial governor who asked him how he predicted danger so accurately. Wenjia simply bowed and replied, "I walk quietly, so I hear more." Historians often condense such stories into a single lesson, but the truth is more nuanced. Wenjia understood that the world is not defeated by brilliance alone. It is defeated by alertness. A life lived with all senses open will protect itself long before danger grows teeth. This is what Sun Tzu meant when he wrote that invincibility lies in defense. He did not mean hiding behind walls. He meant cultivating a mind that cannot be surprised. You may not carry goods along treacherous roads, but you carry dreams through a world filled with subtle traps. The trap of comparison. The trap of rushing. The trap of believing that speed equals progress. If you move too quickly, you do not notice who watches you. If you speak too freely, you do not notice which doors close. If you chase every opportunity, you never realize which ones were designed to bleed you. Wealth is not earned by force. It grows in the quiet soil beneath your choices. But there is another side to this war, a deeper current that runs beneath every strategic mind. Sun Tzu taught that winning without fighting is the highest form of mastery. Most people misunderstand this. They think it means surrender or passivity. In truth, it is the opposite. Winning without fighting means placing yourself in such an advantageous position that conflict evaporates before it even forms. It means preparing so thoroughly that obstacles lose their shape when they approach you. It means having so much clarity that hesitation cannot seep into your decisions. Modern society rewards noise. The loudest voices often draw the most attention, but they rarely hold the deepest insight. In markets, those who shout the loudest often fall the fastest, because noise reveals intention, and intention, once visible, can be exploited. This is why the old masters moved like water, not because they sought to be soft, but because water adapts to the shape of every challenge. It flows around obstacles, not through them. It carves mountains without ever raising its voice. You are not here to memorize Sun Tzu. You are here to undergo a shift in perception, to see the patterns hidden in the world around you. to understand the kind of power that does not demand attention, but quietly shapes reality. The firelight flickers on your face now, and as the flames rise and collapse, they mirror the fortunes of empires long gone. Every victory, every defeat, every downfall you will hear tonight was born from a single decision. Sometimes a decision made in a moment of fear, sometimes in arrogance, sometimes in wisdom. Your own life will be shaped by similar moments. The difference is that now you are preparing to understand them. You are learning to step into the battlefield awake, not reactive, not overwhelmed, awake. If you are ready, we will continue deeper into this world. The first chapter begins with the tale of a brilliant general who lost everything because the enemy learned his rhythm. It is a story carved into the stones of the Silk Road, a warning for anyone who moves through life without guarding the pattern of their steps. As the night deepens, allow your mind to travel far beyond the warmth of this fire. Imagine the world as it once was, shaped not by satellites and screens, but by the slow pulse of caravans moving across desert plains. Picture the Silk Road under a pale moon, stretching like a silver vein through mountains and drifting sands. That ancient world was filled with dangers we no longer face, yet strangely, its lessons echo more loudly in our era than ever before. Every struggle for survival, every calculated risk, every betrayal disguised as friendship was driven by the same invisible forces that shape the markets, careers, and ambitions of today. Sun Tzu understood something timeless. He recognized that conflict is not an eruption, but a climate. It forms gradually. It gathers unseen. It reveals itself only when it is already too late for the unprepared. A scroll discovered in a ruined Tang outpost contained a line that scholars rarely quote because its meaning unsettles modern sensibilities. It read, "A man wakes to find he has been fighting for half his life without knowing the enemy." The author remains unknown, but the truth feels hauntingly familiar. Most people move through their days unaware of the subtle contests surrounding them. They underestimate rivals. They trust too easily. They assume that fairness is a universal language when it has rarely been spoken. This blindness was the downfall of many. There is an obscure tale in the Dunhuang manuscripts of a minor general who once commanded a distant northern garrison. His name appears only once in historical texts, but his mistake lives on as a cautionary whisper. He believed his enemy too weak to matter. He dismissed reports of scouts spotting movement in the dunes. He wrote to a colleague that the desert itself would protect him. Yet one morning, when the first light brushed the tops of the sand, he discovered that the enemy had tunneled beneath the dunes and risen in silence during the night. His fortress did not fall through force. It fell because he trusted the comfort of routine. You might think this has nothing to do with you, but the truth sits uncomfortably close. Every complacent assumption you make becomes an unlocked gate in your life. Every habit you leave unexamined becomes a predictable pattern someone else can anticipate. Employers observe your rhythm. Competitors notice your hesitation. Markets punish the familiar and reward the adaptable. And behind all of this lies the quiet principle Sun Tzu carved into the heart of his philosophy. Awareness is the first strategy, and without it, no other strategy matters. There is another manuscript, a fragile piece of bamboo recovered from a damp tomb near Hubei. Its edges are broken, and many of its characters have faded, yet one passage is still legible. It describes a wandering strategist who claimed that the greatest victories are won by those who see the invisible structure beneath events. He compared life to a river flowing between unseen banks. Most people look only at the water, never realizing that the direction of the current is shaped by something deeper. His lesson was simple. If you learn to read the hidden contours of a situation, you gain the ability to move with it rather than against it. This ability is not inherited. It is learned through attention, reflection, and the discipline of slow observation. Sun Tzu's world may seem distant, but human nature has not changed. Ambition still drives people to take risks they cannot measure. Fear still blinds men at the moment they most need clarity. Greed still pushes armies, corporations, and individuals into choices that unravel the very foundations they stand on. Yet just as in ancient times, there are those who rise above this chaos, not because they are stronger or more gifted, but because they understand the flow beneath the surface. They know when to advance, when to hold, when to conceal, and when to strike. Their power does not roar. It resonates. This prologue is preparing you for the deeper layers of the Sun Tzu Market War. The stories ahead will reveal how victories were crafted long before the first confrontation, how survival was ensured by those willing to think beyond the immediate moment, how wealth and freedom belong to those who master their inner terrain before attempting to shape the outer world. If you are ready, we will proceed to the final part of the prologue before entering Chapter 1, where the tale of a brilliant general will reveal the tragic cost of becoming predictable in a world that rewards unpredictability. There is a quiet moment, right before dawn, when the world seems to hold its breath. The air is neither night nor morning, and every shadow looks uncertain of its own shape. In ancient times, generals treasured this moment. They believed it revealed truths that daylight would later conceal. The mind is most honest when the world is half asleep. It whispers warnings you ignored the day before. It shows you the contours of your fears with an uncomfortable clarity. Sun Tzu often rose during this hour, walking alone along the misted banks of rivers or through the pines near military camps. His soldiers thought he was communing with spirits. In reality, he was studying the nature of uncertainty. He believed that a person who trains themselves to be calm in the half-light would never be paralyzed by the chaos of battle. One of the rare surviving anecdotes about Sun Tzu comes from a later Han historian who claimed to have met a descendant of the Wu nobility. This nobleman recounted a story that his family had guarded for generations. He said that Sun Tzu once refused to engage in a battle that his king desperately wanted. The king believed the enemy was weak, scattered, and unprepared. Sun Tzu, however, had sensed something unusual. He noticed that the wind shifted too sharply at night. He observed that birds avoided a particular ridge. He watched his own soldiers grow restless without understanding why. These were not omens in the mystical sense. They were subtleties, signals that something was out of rhythm. When scouts finally returned, They revealed that the enemy had built hidden defenses in the valley, traps that would have slaughtered Sun Tzu's entire force. The king was furious, but Sun Tzu's silence saved thousands of lives. His discipline was simple but rare. He refused to be rushed by the expectations of others. This reluctance to move before understanding the terrain is precisely what the modern world has forgotten. Today's society glorifies speed. People are praised for acting quickly, responding instantly, making decisions before thought has time to ripen. Yet every rushed decision delivers you deeper into someone else's design. Markets collapse because of panic. Careers implode because of impulsive choices. Investments fail because a person mistaken motion for strategy. But Sun Tzu's wisdom remains unchanged. It tells us that the one who pauses with purpose is often the one who sees the entire battlefield long before the enemy recognizes the game has begun. There is another mysterious fragment found within the bamboo annals, one that historians argue about because its meaning is as delicate as the material it was written on. It says that the wise commander studies the shadow of the enemy, not the shape. Scholars interpret this in different ways. Some say it means you should not focus on what your opponent claims to be. Others say it means that a shadow reveals movement more clearly than a body does. But there is a more intimate interpretation, and it is the one that matters here. You must learn to look at the effects of a situation rather than its appearance. Look at how a choice alters the rhythm of your life. Look at how a person's presence changes your intuition. Look at how a financial decision affects your peace before it affects your bank account. These shadows reveal more truth than any bold claim or promising opportunity. As the prologue nears its end, imagine Sun Tzu standing behind you, not as a distant figure from ancient scrolls, but as a quiet mentor who has studied the nature of conflict long enough to see through every illusion. He does not demand that you become a warrior. He asks only that you awaken. The world you live in rewards awakened minds. It rewards those who observe carefully, speak sparingly, and resist the urge to reveal their hand before the moment is right. You have already taken your first step by listening, and soon, in the chapters ahead, you will learn how to shape your own terrain, choose your own battles, and walk with the same quiet certainty as the strategists who shaped the fate of kingdoms. The fire burns lower now, but its warmth remains steady. The next part of our journey will guide you into the story of a gifted general whose brilliance became his trap. Through him, you will see why the most dangerous enemy is the one who studies your rhythm. The final lesson of this prologue does not come from a general or a strategist, but from a wanderer whose name has long been lost. His story appears only once, in a scroll so damaged by moisture that most of its characters have dissolved into pale stains. Yet the single surviving passage carries a weight far greater than its fragile bamboo deserves. It tells of a traveler who journeyed along the borders of kingdoms, observing battles from a distance, never joining either side. When asked why he wandered near war but never participated, he answered with a quiet conviction. "I do not fear battle," he said. "I fear entering a war I did not choose." Those words echo painfully in our world today. Most people find themselves entangled in conflicts they never intended. They compete with coworkers for promotions they do not even want. They race to meet standards set by people they do not respect. They chase wealth using strategies designed by voices they barely know. And all the while, they believe they are fighting for themselves, when in truth, they have stepped into someone else's battlefield. This is the trap Sun Tzu warns us about, though he cloaks it in the language of ancient warfare. You must choose your terrain. You must define your purpose. You must shape your strategy before the world shapes it for you. Otherwise, every victory will taste hollow, and every defeat will feel inevitable. In the quiet hours before dawn, when Sun Tzu walked alone, he was not pondering troop formations or supply routes. He was refining something far more essential. He was studying the inner landscape of the mind. He believed that the most decisive wars are fought within a person long before they face an external challenge. Clarity is not merely an advantage. It is armor. There is a curious rumor whispered among archivists who study early commentaries on the art of war. They claim that one lost chapter, now known only through reference in a later text, described a concept called still victory. It suggested that a person could win a conflict simply by being so centered, so immovable in their intentions, that opposition crumbled without a single action taken. Some dismiss this idea as legend. Others say it is the highest form of mastery. But whether it existed or not, the principle resonates through every preserved passage of Sun Tzu's work. The ultimate victory is the one that requires no struggle because the outcome was shaped long before the battle became visible. As this prologue closes, the fire beside you has softened into a bed of glowing embers. Their gentle heat mirrors the truth we have been circling around. You are not powerless in this quiet war. You are not a spectator, and you are not doomed to repeat the mistakes of the unprepared. You stand now at the threshold of a deeper understanding. The chapters ahead will not simply tell you stories. They will teach you to recognize the hidden architecture beneath conflict, the subtle currents that move markets, the quiet signs that reveal danger, and the rare moments when opportunity glows faintly before anyone else notices its light. If you choose to continue, we will step into Chapter 1 and begin with the story of a brilliant general whose downfall was carved not by weakness, but by predictability. His fate will reveal the first great law of the Sun Tzu Market War: the enemy who learns your rhythm owns your future. The desert does not forgive repetition. Every dune remembers every footstep. Every ridge keeps the echo of every caravan that has dared to cross its spine. And on a winter evening, during the reign of Emperor Wu of the Han, General Li Guang rode across that shifting expanse with the quiet confidence of a man who believed the sands were loyal to him. For decades, he had moved through these borderlands like a phantom, striking fear into the Yongnu with nothing more than a bow, a horse, and a peculiar gift for anticipating danger. Soldiers called him the Flying General, a name spoken with awe, but also with a strange tenderness. His victories felt effortless, as though the desert itself bent to guide him. But fate has a way of turning mastery into blindness. Every successful maneuver becomes a thread, and eventually those threads weave a pattern visible even to an enemy hiding beyond the horizon. Li Guang's final campaign began with an uneasy sky. The wind shifted erratically, carrying the scent of cold iron from somewhere unseen. Scouts reported that the Xiongnu had retreated into the northern steppes, but the footprints they left behind were too clean, too deliberate. Some officers urged caution. Others whispered that the nomads were attempting to lure the general deeper into unfamiliar terrain. But Li Guang, seasoned and scarred, believed their warnings belonged to younger men, to soldiers who had never stood alone before a charging wave of horsemen. He had survived dozens of encounters. He had won battles against impossible odds. He trusted the rhythm of his instincts, the rhythm that had guided him for more than 30 years. And so he rode. Under a moon as pale as bleached bone, Li Guang's forces entered a narrow valley that he had crossed many times before. The ground felt firm beneath the horses. The cliffs echoed with the steady march of troops. The general noted that the air felt strange, too still for a desert night. But he pushed the thought aside. A lifetime of victories blurs the fine line between intuition and arrogance. There is a fragment of a military diary discovered in a collapsed storage pit near Gansu, believed by some scholars to have belonged to a soldier who followed Li Guang during this final march. The handwriting is crude, but one entry stands out. It reads, "The general rides as if the land has sworn loyalty to him. We follow because we believe in him, but something watches from the shadows. Even the sand grows quiet." That night, the valley walls erupted. Arrows rained down with the chaos of a broken storm. The Xiongnu had studied Li Guang for years. They knew his routes. They knew his preferences. They knew that he favored narrow passages because they amplified the advantage of his archers. They anticipated the exact path he would choose and waited in silence until his army walked willingly into their jaws. Li Guang fought with the fury of a cornered spirit. He loosed arrow after arrow into the darkness until his bowstring snapped. He cut his way through the chaos until blood darkened his armor. But the enemy had not attacked the man. They had attacked his pattern. His downfall began long before the first arrow left its bow. It began when he allowed his brilliance to become predictable. Historical accounts later mentioned that he survived the ambush, but was consumed by shame. After the campaign ended in failure, Li Guang refused to face the emperor. He retreated to a secluded tent on the edge of camp and took his own life rather than kneel before the judgment of the court. Some say he wrote a final letter before he died, though its words have been lost. Others claim that he whispered, "I was defeated by the man I once was," though there is no way to confirm such a fragile rumor. Yet whether the words are true or not, the sentiment feels painfully aligned with the shape of his fate. The story of Li Guang is more than a tragedy buried in the sands of the Silk Road. It is the most precise illustration of a truth Sun Tzu recorded centuries earlier. The enemy does not destroy you by guessing your intentions. They destroy you by learning your rhythm. This is where the philosophy begins to reveal its depth. Sun Tzu taught that form invites attack. He urged commanders to adopt the nature of water, which holds no constant shape and reveals no predictable path. Water flows differently each time it touches the same rock. It moves by sensing weakness, not by following memory. A mind that behaves like water cannot be ambushed the way Li Guang was. It cannot be anticipated. It cannot be cornered by an enemy who believes they understand its next step. When your life becomes routine, your vulnerabilities become visible. When your choices follow a pattern, someone else eventually learns it. This is as true in ancient warfare as it is in modern markets. Because the moment you become predictable, the world quietly prepares your ambush. And this leads us to the financial lesson woven behind the myth. Predictability is the enemy of survival. Businesses that broadcast their strategies are the first to suffer sabotage. Investors who follow obvious trends are the first to lose money when the trend collapses. A company whose product can be easily understood is a company whose advantage can be stolen. A professional whose behavior is transparent becomes the pawn of someone else's strategy. In finance, predictability is the tax you pay for comfort. And the tax is expensive. Li Guang never realized he was marching toward an ambush because he forgot that others were studying him. In the world of money, the same principle applies. Competitors watch. Markets watch. Opportunists watch. The moment they can anticipate your move, your position is already weaker than you think. There is a path out of this vulnerability, but it requires a shift in how you move, how you choose, and how you reveal yourself. That path begins in the next chunk, where we explore the philosophy behind formlessness and how it translates into silent advantage in the real world. When dawn finally rose over the valley where Li Guang had been ambushed, the light revealed something far more devastating than bodies or broken arrows. It revealed the precision of an enemy who understood him better than he understood himself. The Xiongnu had not chosen the valley because it was strategic. They chose it because it was his. Every detail of the trap had been crafted around the general's habits, his assumptions, his memories of past victories. They had mapped his mind, not the terrain. This is the part of the story most historians glide past. They recount the ambush, the panic, the failure, but they do not linger on the deeper truth hidden beneath it. Li Guang's downfall did not occur that night. It began years earlier, in moments so small they barely seemed worth noticing. After each successful battle, he grew slightly more confident in the methods that saved him. After each escape, he trusted more deeply the instinct that had always guided him. After decades of survival, he felt almost chosen, as though the desert knew him and favored him. But the desert has no loyalty. It records every pattern without judgment. And eventually, someone else reads those patterns, someone who walks with a colder purpose. There is a compelling rumor preserved in a lesser-known text called the Autumn Chronicles, a collection of military commentaries compiled during the Five Dynasties period. It claims that a Xiongnu chieftain once described Li Guang with a strange mix of admiration and disdain. He reportedly said, "The flying general rides with the same breath each time he enters the valley. His shadow returns before he does." The phrase is poetic, but it carries a chilling meaning. His movements were so consistent that even his enemy could predict his presence before it was visible. His shadow, the idea of him, arrived first. That is the philosophical heart of this chapter, the danger of becoming a shape the world can read. Sun Tzu's wisdom is full of metaphors about water, clouds, shadows, mirrors, empty spaces. Many people interpret these as poetic flourishes, but they were practical instructions disguised in beauty. A commander must never repeat himself in a way that crystallizes into vulnerability. A mind must flow. A strategy must shift. A life must evolve. When you stop evolving, you stop being invisible. There is a particular line in the art of war that scholars often overlook because it appears so gentle. Move when it is advantageous. Create no shape that can be seized. It sounds serene, almost passive, but its implications are razor sharp. If you want to survive, you must ensure that no one can wrap their hand around your intentions. Li Guang had spent decades surviving with brilliance, but brilliance becomes brittle when it hardens into routine. And that is where his story touches the deepest layer of Sun Tzu's philosophy. The enemy defeated him not with superior force, but with superior observation. They watched him long enough to see the lines of his life, the rhythm of his steps, the curve of his instincts. They learned him the way a hunter learns the behavior of an animal that returns to the same watering hole each night. In modern language, we would call this an intelligence failure. But in timeless language, it is a reminder that the world studies us constantly. People reveal themselves in ways they never intend. The tone of their emails, the timing of their reactions, the errands they run without thinking, the fears they repeat when they are tired. The markets themselves map our psychology. Companies track consumer patterns. Competitors examine our product releases. Algorithms learn our impulses, weaknesses, desires. Predictability is a kind of confession. And once you confess your patterns, someone will eventually weaponize them. This is why Sun Tzu urged leaders to embrace formlessness, not chaos, not indecision, formlessness, a state of being where you act with intention but do not leave a trail that can be followed, a life where your moves are deliberate but unpatterned, a mind that adapts so fluidly that no enemy can anticipate the next step. To understand this, consider the ancient concept of Liu Dun, the 6 evasions recorded in a rare military manuscript discovered in a Han tomb near Yinke Mountain. It describes strategies not for attacking, but for making oneself unreadable. One of the principles states, "When the enemy expects you to go left, do not go right. Become a pathless forest." Another warns, "Do not rely on a skill you have mastered. Its shadow will betray you." The manuscript reads like a hidden appendix to the art of war, a whisper of how to preserve your advantage by remaining ungraspable. But formlessness is not only a military concept. It lives quietly in the financial world, shaping the destinies of those who understand it. Because in finance, predictability is the most dangerous liability. Consider the countless companies that rose on a single product model or a single marketing strategy. Their competitors dissected them, reverse-engineered them, learned their patterns, then overtook them. Consider investors who follow the same indicators, the same time horizons, the same emotional cycles. Algorithms prey on them, anticipating their moves and exploiting their predictability. Consider professionals who behave consistently in negotiations, who reveal too much, too soon, too often. Their predictability becomes the rope that binds them. You do not lose when you are weak. You lose when you become readable. Li Guang's tragedy is not ancient. It is modern. It is happening every day in boardrooms, trading floors, offices, and industries. And it stems from the same principle. The world always studies those who move too confidently along familiar paths. But there is a remedy, and it begins with understanding the philosophy behind water itself. Water is never the same twice. It shifts with the terrain. It does not cling to the past. It does not assume that tomorrow's path will resemble yesterday's, because it knows that rigidity is a slow surrender. In the next chunk, we will enter the final layer of this chapter. We will translate the philosophy of formlessness into precise, practical strategies for protecting your decisions, your business, and your wealth in a world where everything you reveal becomes a potential ambush. When scholars reflect on Li Guang's defeat, they often focus on the emotional tragedy of a hero whose life ended in humiliation. But beneath the grief, there is a far more valuable truth. His downfall reveals the anatomy of vulnerability in any competitive landscape, whether it is a battlefield, a marketplace, or the corridors of modern power. The moment your behavior becomes legible, someone with patience and ambition can write the next chapter of your story for you. In the world of finance, this principle is not merely poetic. It is measurable. It shapes entire industries. It determines winners and losers long before a product launches or a market moves. And its influence can be traced in examples as old as ancient trade guilds and as modern as digital platforms. But before we enter the financial terrain, it is important to understand one more dimension of Li Guang's fate. There is a lesser-known anecdote preserved in the scrolls of a Tang historian named Wei Shun, a historian who often recorded stories that others dismissed as too unusual or too intimate for official accounts. Wei Shun claimed that the Xiongnu chieftain responsible for the ambush had developed a near obsession with studying Li Guang's campaigns. He reportedly kept a map marked with every route Li Guang had ever traveled. He tracked the rhythm of the general's military decisions. He even consulted older tribal warriors who had once faced him, asking them not how he fought, but how he thought. One elder is said to have given the chieftain a warning disguised as admiration. "Do not chase the flying general where he is today," he said. "Chase him where he always returns." That single insight shaped the trap that would one day close around Li Guang like a tightening fist. This concept has a profound parallel in the modern financial world, where entire fortunes are built not by reacting to what people do, but by predicting what they always do. And the more predictable a person or a company becomes, the easier it is for someone else to profit from their rhythm. In investing, predictable behavior creates price patterns. It reveals panic points. It exposes the emotional habits of traders. Algorithms feed on these patterns like wolves tracking wounded prey across snow. They detect when inexperienced investors will sell, when they will buy, when they will freeze. And once these patterns are identified, the market does not merely observe them. It devours them. In business, predictability is an even more delicate vulnerability. Companies that reveal too much of their strategy allow competitors to anticipate their next move. A corporation that expands in a uniform pattern can be cornered before it realizes what is happening. A founder who communicates too openly about plans may inspire rivals to move faster. Even the tone of quarterly reports can be analyzed for consistency or weakness. The modern world is a web of observers, and every pattern is a thread someone else can tug. There is a well-documented phenomenon in hostile takeovers where predators do not strike when a company is at its weakest, but when its behavior becomes so routine that its blind spots widen into obvious openings. Predictability is the soil in which ambushes grow. A company that maintains the same product cycle, the same hiring pattern, the same acquisition strategy becomes an open book. It becomes Li Guang walking into the valley again and again. In personal finance, the danger is subtler, but just as real. A person who maintains rigid habits in spending, saving, or investing exposes themselves to exploitation. Subscription models, targeted ads, and algorithmic pricing all depend on predictable behavior. When your actions follow a straight line, the system bends that line into profit for someone else. But here is the part that transforms this chapter from a warning into a strategy. The opposite of predictability is not chaos. It is intentional ambiguity. It is disciplined variation. It is moving like water, not in randomness, but in responsiveness. A river does not choose its shape at random. It molds itself to the terrain with quiet intelligence. It changes course when the landscape demands it, and by doing so, it becomes impossible to corner. This is the path Li Guang never learned. He mastered instinct, but not evolution. He mastered courage, but not concealment. And this is where the modern strategist can rise where he fell. To survive in a competitive world, you must cultivate a mind that is unreadable to those who analyze your movements. This does not mean hiding everything. It means revealing only what strengthens you and concealing everything that weakens you. A negotiator should vary their tone, pace, and decision patterns. An investor should avoid emotional routines. A business should rethink predictable release cycles. A professional should avoid giving away their intentions before the moment is right. Sun Tzu described this elegantly when he wrote that the supreme warrior moves in the shadows and strikes like thunder. The phrasing is poetic, but its meaning is practical. You win by becoming invisible until the moment visibility serves you. There is a fascinating footnote in a Qing-era commentary on the art of war. It suggests that the strongest enemy is not the one with the sharpest blade, but the one whose next move you cannot calculate. This applies equally to markets, negotiations, career trajectories, and wealth-building strategies. Power lives in the place where others cannot anticipate you. If Li Guang had varied his path even slightly, if he had chosen an unexpected route or paused long enough to question the familiarity of the valley, history would remember him differently. But his genius calcified into routine, and routine became the rope that pulled him toward ruin. In the modern world, the same principle holds true. Success breeds comfort. Comfort breeds repetition. Repetition breeds vulnerability. And vulnerability invites the one thing Sun Tzu warned about with almost prophetic clarity: ambush. But foreknowledge and adaptability can reverse this cycle. And that is where the next chapter will lead us. For now, we close the story of Li Guang with the one truth that outlives his tragedy. You are safest when you are unreadable. You are strongest when your direction cannot be mapped. You are wealthiest when your strategy cannot be predicted by anyone watching. There are moments in history when the world seems to pause, as though holding its breath to watch a single mind illuminate the darkness. The winter before the Battle of Red Cliff was such a moment. The land was fractured by ambition. Warlords carved China into trembling territories, each man convinced he was destined to rule. Armies gathered like storm clouds. The Yangtze River glimmered with the faint reflection of an empire on the brink. And in the midst of this tension stood a quiet strategist who spoke softly, moved deliberately, and understood that perception could reshape the fate of nations. Zhuge Liang was not born into power. He lived as a recluse in Longzhong, farming the land with his own hands and living beneath a thatched roof that creaked in the wind. Yet his reputation traveled farther than any army. Scholars whispered about the young sage who could predict the turning of seasons, the rise of men, the collapse of dynasties. They said he studied the world the way others study scriptures, with patience and reverence, listening for the hidden rhythm beneath events. When the warlord Liu Bei visited him 3 times, seeking wisdom on how to oppose the overwhelming might of Cao Cao, Zhuge Liang finally stepped out of seclusion. He agreed to lend his mind to a cause that seemed hopeless. Cao Cao commanded nearly 1 million men on paper, though the true number is debated. Historians argue whether he marched with 800,000 or 200,000, but the difference is irrelevant. His force dwarfed anything the Southern Alliance could muster. The Yangtze was filled with the creaking hulls of his warships, stretching across the water like an iron spine. Against such force, ordinary strategy would have been suicide. But Zhuge Liang was not an ordinary strategist. There is a lesser-known tale recounted in the Jiangxia records, a document rarely cited in mainstream history. It tells of a private moment between Zhuge Liang and his elder brother, Zhuge Jin, shortly before the alliance was formed. Zhuge Jin urged him to be cautious, warning that aligning with the southern commander, Zhou Yu, could end in betrayal. Zhuge Liang reportedly smiled in that calm, distant way that unnerved even his closest companions. He said, "A man who sails with the wind cannot be betrayed by the water." It was a cryptic statement, but in retrospect, it revealed the philosophy that would shape one of the greatest victories in Chinese warfare. Zhuge Liang understood that the battle would not be won by force of arms. It would be won by shaping perception, by making an enemy believe something so convincingly that he would guide himself toward his own destruction. As Cao Cao's forces advanced, Zhuge Liang began crafting illusions. He assessed not only the terrain, but the psychology of those who marched across it. Cao Cao was brilliant, but he was proud. He trusted the size of his army more than the subtleties of geography. He believed that strength alone guaranteed victory. Zhuge Liang's plan depended entirely on this arrogance. The wind that winter was merciless. Cold currents swept across the river, carrying the scent of smoke and frost. The Southern Alliance had fewer men, fewer supplies, and fewer ships. Zhou Yu, the naval commander, was racked with illness and frustration. The alliance was unstable, held together by desperation. Yet Zhuge Liang moved calmly across the encampment, observing soldiers, studying the flow of the river, watching the sky. There is an intriguing rumor recorded by a Ming scholar who collected obscure folk traditions from Sichuan. According to local storytellers, Zhuge Liang spent a night atop a cliff overlooking the river, burning incense and whispering calculations to the wind. While this borders on myth, it captures an essential truth. Whether through observation or intuition, Zhuge Liang anticipated the shift in the weather that would make everything possible. He understood that fire would be the weapon, but fire alone was not enough. The wind needed to blow eastward, something that almost never happened during that season. Zhou Yu mocked the idea at first, calling it a poet's fantasy. But Zhuge Liang insisted that the natural world moved in cycles that most men never noticed. He believed that if the moment was right, the heavens would assist those who acted with clarity. Preparing for that moment required deception of the highest order. Zhuge Liang knew that Cao Cao feared southern naval superiority. To amplify this fear, he instructed allied commanders to spread false reports, create staged naval displays, and exaggerate their confidence. Cao Cao, suspicious by nature, began imagining hidden depths in the southern fleet. His anxiety grew. He ordered his ships to be chained together for stability, believing this would prevent them from capsizing in unfamiliar waters. What he did not realize was that this single precaution would make his fleet immovable, perfectly vulnerable to fire. Illusion began to take shape. This is the essence of Zhuge Liang's genius. He did not merely deceive the enemy. He allowed the enemy's own assumptions to ripen into mistakes. His strategy was not to hide the truth, but to let Cao Cao assemble the sword that would later be used against him. Modern historians admire the spectacle of this battle, but few explore the psychological elegance behind it. Red Cliff was not won by fire alone. It was won by the art of shaping belief. This is where the philosophy emerges in its purest form. Sun Tzu taught that the greatest victory is the one won without direct confrontation. Zhuge Liang embraced this principle completely. He could not overpower Cao Cao. He could not outnumber him, but he could influence how Cao Cao interpreted reality. Winning without fighting is not the absence of strategy. It is the height of strategy. Zhuge Liang recognized that human perception is the true battlefield. People see what they expect to see. They overlook what contradicts their story. They cling to their illusions even as they walk straight into danger. Cao Cao marched toward Red Cliff with an army large enough to terrify kingdoms, yet he was blind to the traps created by his own confidence. The illusions Zhuge Liang planted were not fog or confusion. They were mirrors held up to Cao Cao's nature, and nature rarely lies. In the next chunk, we will explore the philosophy in greater depth. We will follow Zhuge Liang as he prepares the alliance for the decisive moment and uncover the spiritual law behind victory without struggle, the law that says the world bends not to strength, but to perception. Zhuge Liang understood that every battle begins long before swords are drawn. It begins in the landscape of the mind, in the assumptions that quietly shape a commander's choices. As he walked the southern encampment in the days before the confrontation at Red Cliff, he moved with the stillness of a man who knew that time itself was a weapon. Soldiers watched him with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely rushed. Yet everywhere he stepped, tension softened. Even generals twice his age found themselves listening when he spoke. The alliance between Liu Bei and Sun Quan was fragile, stitched together by mutual fear of Cao Cao's ambition. Many officers resented Zhuge Liang's presence, believing that a man from the north could not be trusted with the fate of the south. But Zhou Yu, despite his pride, recognized something remarkable in the young strategist. He once confessed privately that speaking with Zhuge Liang felt like speaking with the river itself, as though the man understood currents that others could not see. What Zhuge Liang saw was not the army in front of him, but the story unfolding around them. Cao Cao believed he had already won. He believed that the size of his force made him invincible. He believed the South would bow before his might. And even more dangerously, he believed that his enemies shared these assumptions. Zhuge Liang's task was to turn that belief into a snare so subtle that Cao Cao would not realize he was marching toward ruin until the flames rose behind him. There is an obscure detail in the Nan Commandery Scrolls, a set of documents discovered in the late Qing dynasty during repairs to a collapsed granary. One passage describes how Zhuge Liang instructed farmers, fishermen, and boatmen to spread rumors along the riverbank. These rumors were not random. They were crafted like brushstrokes, each one painting Cao Cao as a conqueror stepping into unfamiliar waters. The river folk spoke of southern winds that shifted unpredictably, of diseases that clung to northern troops, of swamp mists that swallowed entire units. They whispered these tales to captured scouts, knowing the stories would be carried back to Cao Cao's ears. It was subtle psychological warfare, designed not to terrify him, but to make him uneasy, to make him second-guess details he would normally ignore. A commander who pauses too long becomes easier to shape. Zhou Yu, despite his rivalry with Zhuge Liang, recognized the elegance of these tactics. But there was one thing he could not accept: Zhuge Liang's prediction of the east wind. At that time of year, the winds along the Yangtze blew westward with near certainty. Asking Zhou Yu to believe in an east wind was akin to asking him to believe that winter rain would suddenly turn into summer blossoms. Yet Zhuge Liang insisted that nature itself would assist them. Zhou Yu fell violently ill around this time. Some legends say it was stress. Others claim he was poisoned. A few southern folklore traditions whisper that Zhuge Liang's brilliance aggravated Zhou Yu's heart to the point of collapse. Whatever the truth, the alliance suffered. Generals argued. Supplies dwindled. Morale wavered. And yet Zhuge Liang remained calm. This calmness was not blind optimism. It was rooted in a deeper philosophy that resonates across centuries. When your opponent is stronger, you do not resist their momentum. You redirect it. You allow their confidence to grow so large that it becomes a burden they cannot carry. This principle is beautifully articulated in a commentary attributed to the monk Miao Guang during the Eastern Jin dynasty. He wrote, The wise commander feeds the enemy's shadow until it collapses under its own weight. Zhuge Liang understood this perfectly. Cao Cao's strength was also his weakness. The larger the fleet he brought south, the harder it would be to maneuver. The more soldiers he commanded, the slower they would move. The more confident he became, the less he would question the illusions placed in his path. So Zhuge Liang crafted his next illusion, the deception of complacency. He urged allied commanders to appear disorganized, to pretend uncertainty in front of Cao Cao's scouts, to let their movements look frantic, their morale fragile. The South presented itself as overwhelmed, exhausted and divided. And Cao Cao, whose pride was as vast as his army, believed every moment of it. He wrote letters boasting that the Southern Alliance was cracking. In one surviving fragment of his correspondence, he described Zhuge Liang and Zhou Yu as two clever birds trapped in a single cage. The illusion was complete. But illusions require timing, and timing requires harmony with the natural world. That is where the philosophy behind Zhuge Liang's strategy emerges with almost spiritual clarity. Zhuge Liang believed that victory is not achieved through force, but through alignment. Alignment with the moment, with human nature, with the environment, with the quiet rhythms that govern both opportunity and disaster. This belief reflects a fundamental principle in Sun Tzu's work. The highest form of mastery is the ability to act in accordance with circumstances rather than against them. When circumstances resist you, pushing harder only deepens your failure. But when you sense the direction of the wind, literal or symbolic, you move effortlessly. This is where the legendary moment of the borrowed east wind prepares to enter history. The night before the battle, Zhuge Liang performed an elaborate ritual upon a hill overlooking the river. Some accounts depict him as a mystic summoning the wind. Others portray him as an astronomer reading celestial signs. The truth lies somewhere in between. He understood natural cycles, seasonal shifts, atmospheric patterns that few paid attention to. Whether through observation or intuition, he sensed that the rare east wind was about to come. And that wind would change everything. In the final chunk of this chapter, we will step into the climactic moment when illusion becomes reality, when the natural world bends toward opportunity, and when the philosophy behind winning without fighting finds its most powerful expression, not just as a myth, but as a financial principle that can alter how we move through competition, negotiation, and strategy. The night before, the flames consumed Cao Cao's fleet. The river lay silent as polished obsidian. Frost edged the grasses along the shoreline, and torches flickered with jittery uncertainty, as though sensing the shift that was about to unfold. Soldiers huddled near makeshift fires, whispering prayers and fears in equal measure. No one knew what dawn would bring. Yet far above them, on a ridge overlooking the Yangtze, Zhuge Liang sat beneath a wooden canopy, his sleeves brushing lightly against the cold air as he read the sky. The Alliance had already placed its fire ships in position. Dozens of vessels lined with reeds, pitch, and oil, their hulls soaked in combustibles, waited in eerie quiet like sleeping beasts ready to awaken. The slightest mistake would turn the strategy into a catastrophe. If the wind remained westward, the fire would blow back into the southern fleet, engulfing their own men, their own hopes, their only chance of survival. Zhou Yu had voiced this fear many times, pressing Zhuge Liang with questions, warnings, and accusations. But Zhuge Liang only answered with a calmness that frustrated even his allies. He seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. Just before midnight, a subtle tremor moved through the air. It was not sound. It was not movement. It was a shift so delicate that most men would ignore it as a trick of the mind. But for Zhuge Liang, it was confirmation. The east wind had begun. There is an old anecdote preserved in the Wulin manuscripts, a collection of unofficial histories gathered by scholars who valued rumor as much as recorded fact. It claims that a sentry, half asleep at his post, felt the wind brush across his cheek and thought it was a ghost. When he realized the breeze was coming from the east, he ran to alert his commander, only to find Zhuge Liang already descending the hill with the faintest smile on his face. "The river has answered," he reportedly murmured. Whether or not this moment unfolded exactly as described, the wind did indeed shift, an anomaly so rare that later scholars debated its origin for centuries. Some attributed it to climate patterns, others to astronomical alignment, and some, especially those of later Taoist traditions, believed that Zhuge Liang's alignment with the natural world allowed him to sense what others could not. Whatever the explanation, the result was undeniable. Under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, the Southern Alliance released the fire ships. The vessels drifted like shadows along the river's surface, their sails catching the steady eastward breeze. Cao Cao's fleet, chained together for stability as Zhuge Liang predicted, became a single, immovable target. The northern troops watched the approaching ships with confusion at first, expecting them to veer away. But the hulls did not turn. They accelerated. And then the flames leaped. Eyewitness accounts describe the fire as if it were alive, an orange serpent racing across the water, coiling itself around wooden decks, devouring sails, tearing through rope and timber with a hunger that echoed across the canyon walls. Soldiers shouted commands, many too late to matter. The chains that were meant to stabilize the fleet now trapped them, binding ship to ship, turning each vessel into a torch that illuminated its neighbor's destruction. The fire raged uncontrollably, feeding on pitch, oil, and the desperation of men trying to break free. Horses screamed, drums cracked, masts fell like burning spears. The night sky glowed with a terrible brilliance, reflected in the eyes of soldiers who realized they were witnessing not a battle, but a collapse. Zhuge Liang watched from the ridge, his expression unreadable. Victory did not bring him joy. It simply confirmed a truth he understood deeply, that force is never the true engine of triumph. It is perception, timing, and the precise shaping of opportunity. Zhou Yu, carried on a stretcher due to his illness, witnessed the fiery spectacle with awe. According to one chronicle, he whispered, "This man's brilliance steals even the winds." It was a moment of admiration tinged with envy, for Zhou Yu knew that the Alliance's survival had hinged not on his command, but on Zhuge Liang's ability to bend the world without raising a sword. This is the philosophical essence of Red Cliff. Victory without direct confrontation. Victory through alignment rather than resistance. Victory through the art of shaping what the enemy believes. Cao Cao's downfall was sealed not by fire, but by illusion. He believed he understood his enemy. He believed his fleet was unassailable. He believed the world would bend to the weight of his numbers. And Zhuge Liang allowed him to keep believing all the way to the moment where belief became a blade. This principle resonates far beyond ancient warfare. It is a law of human nature, repeated endlessly in every era. People see what supports their confidence. They ignore what contradicts it. They walk into traps constructed by their own assumptions. And this is where the financial lesson emerges with perfect clarity. In the modern world, the most powerful victories are won not through confrontation, but through narrative control. Businesses that shape perception dominate markets. Investors who understand sentiment outperform those who rely on data alone. Negotiators who guide expectations win before terms are even discussed. Red Cliff is not only a story about fire. It is a story about the invisible architecture beneath decision-making. Consider companies that create illusions of scarcity to elevate the value of their products. Or tech firms that announce vague prototypes to unsettle competitors. Or CEOs who release carefully timed messages to control market sentiment. These tactics are modern echoes of Zhuge Liang's illusions. They win without direct conflict. They change behavior by shaping perception. In negotiations, the person who controls the narrative controls the outcome. The one who enters a deal appearing weaker may be stronger. The one who appears uncertain may be concealing the advantage. You win by influencing what the other side thinks you want, not by revealing it. Investing follows the same law. Markets are moved by perception long before fundamentals catch up. A stock rises not because of raw numbers, but because belief propels it. Entire bubbles form from illusions. Entire crashes follow the collapse of those illusions. Zhuge Liang would argue that the market is simply a battlefield of perception, and the greatest investors are those who see through illusions while crafting their own. This is why winning without fighting is not a mystical idea. It is a practical one. It is the ability to shape outcomes through subtlety, timing, and narrative rather than force. It is the art of letting others reveal their weaknesses while you remain unseen. Red Cliff endures as a reminder that true power does not roar. It whispers. It nudges. It influences quietly until the world moves in alignment with your intention. The fire that consumed Cao Cao's fleet began as an idea in the mind of a strategist who understood that the strongest victories are the ones earned before the enemy even notices the game has begun. With this chapter complete, we now turn to the tale of Yamamoto in Chapter 3, a mastery of strategy poisoned by overconfidence, showing how brilliance can collapse when noise disguises itself as clarity. The Pacific Ocean has a way of swallowing sound. Waves rise and fall with a rhythm so vast that even the echoes of war dissolve into insignificance. Yet beneath its surface lies one of the most haunting lessons in the history of strategy, a lesson carved not by defeat, but by the seduction of early victories. It is the story of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a man whose brilliance glowed so fiercely that it blinded even himself. Before he became the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto lived a life shaped by contradictions. He was a warrior who feared war. He was a patriot who doubted the judgment of the government he served. He was a man who loved America's industry, admired its spirit, and understood its strength more deeply than any of his contemporaries. And yet, paradoxically, he designed one of the most daring military strikes in modern history. But the story of Yamamoto's downfall did not begin on the day American forces decoded the message that sealed his fate. It began much earlier, in the quiet chambers of command rooms, in the corridors where pride whispered more loudly than reason, and in the hearts of men who mistook early success for invincibility. Yamamoto was born into a samurai family, but he was no ordinary naval officer. He studied at Harvard, traveled across America, and spent countless hours observing factories in Detroit and Chicago. While other officers romanticized Japan's spiritual purity, Yamamoto admired the massive engines of American productivity. He understood something that few in Tokyo were willing to accept. Japan could not survive a prolonged war with the United States. One of the more obscure accounts of his life comes from a personal letter discovered decades later in a private collection in Kyoto. The letter, addressed to an old friend, contains a line rarely quoted in mainstream histories. "I fear," Yamamoto wrote, "that our pride is louder than our wisdom." He had sensed the gathering storm long before it could be measured on maps or charts. Yet despite this insight, he was tasked with doing the very thing he warned against. When Japan's leaders demanded a decisive blow to shock the United States into negotiation, Yamamoto crafted a plan so audacious that it stunned the world. The early hours of December 7th were not a fluke of luck. They were the result of months of meticulous planning, deception, and near-perfect timing. The attack on Pearl Harbor crippled the American Pacific Fleet in a matter of hours. It was a tactical masterpiece, and that was precisely the problem. Success, especially spectacular success, has a way of muting doubt. It creates a hollow space where caution used to live. It silences the quiet voice that warns against hubris. Something subtle shifts in the minds of men after a brilliant victory. What was once a warning becomes an inconvenience. What was once fear becomes momentum. And that momentum becomes a trap. Yamamoto understood this danger. But his subordinates, intoxicated by the triumph of Pearl Harbor, began to see the war through the lens of invincibility. They misread America's resolve. They misread the endurance of a nation whose strength Yamamoto had studied firsthand. They misread the silence after the attack as defeat, not preparation. There is a little-known anecdote recorded by a junior officer who served aboard Yamamoto's flagship. After the news of Pearl Harbor spread, officers gathered in the command hall to celebrate. They toasted to victory, imagining that America would crumble in a matter of months. Yamamoto did not join them. Instead, he stood outside on the deck, staring into the moonlit horizon. When the officer asked why he did not celebrate, Yamamoto replied quietly, "This success is the seed of our suffering. It will bloom in ways they cannot yet see. His voice was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of inevitability. In the weeks that followed, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with alarming speed. Island after island fell. Fleets moved like shadows carving paths through water. It seemed as though Yamamoto's fears had been misplaced. Yet every victory carried the same hidden flaw. Japan was expanding its territory faster than it could sustain. Every success depended on assumptions about America's weakness, assumptions Yamamoto knew were false. The first cracks appeared at the Battle of Midway. Many historians attribute the Midway disaster to intelligence failures, strategic miscalculations, or bad luck. But the deeper truth is far more uncomfortable. Japan lost the battle the way Li Guang lost his final campaign, through predictability born of overconfidence. Japanese forces moved with the rhythm of men who believed the enemy was still reeling. They underestimated the power of preparation. They assumed the momentum of early victories would shield them from ambush. But America had studied them. America had read their patterns. And once a pattern is visible, it is exploitable. Yamamoto knew the consequences immediately. A witness who observed him during the aftermath described him as a man carrying the ghost of a future he had tried to warn us about. It was not the loss of ships that haunted him. It was the collapse of an illusion, the illusion of invincibility. Later, when American cryptologists decoded the message revealing his flight route, Yamamoto met his death with the same calm he carried throughout his life. His last mission was meant to raise morale. Instead, it became a symbol of how vulnerability increases when success blinds the senses. The philosophy behind his story is sharp and unforgiving. Overconfidence is a spiritual distortion. It is noise disguised as clarity. It is the fog that rises after victory, obscuring the dangers that were always there. Sun Tzu understood this deeply. He warned that the general who wins easily becomes careless. The general who fears nothing becomes blind. The general who confuses momentum with inevitability invites ruin. In finance, this principle is not metaphorical. It is measurable. Entire fortunes vanish when investors assume that past performance guarantees future safety. Entrepreneurs collapse when early success convinces them that nothing can go wrong. Traders lose everything when they mistake luck for skill. Like Yamamoto's officers, they toast too early, misreading silence for surrender and momentum for mastery. In the next chunk, we will examine the philosophy behind overconfidence and noise, how victories distort perception, how illusions form in the mind, and how Sun Tzu's teachings provide a shield against the most seductive trap in wealth building: the belief that success is proof of invulnerability. In the months following Midway, a strange heaviness settled across the Japanese command. It was not spoken aloud. It did not appear in documents or orders. It lived instead in the quiet moments, when officers hesitated before offering strategic suggestions, when radio operators paused before transmitting messages, when navigators stared a little too long at their maps, as though hoping numbers might reveal a different truth. For the first time since the war began, the momentum no longer felt like destiny. It felt like a river suddenly flowing against them. Yamamoto sensed this shift with painful clarity. His instincts had always been tuned to the subtle currents beneath events, and now he felt the tide reversing. But what troubled him most was not the enemy's strength. It was the psychological fog spreading among his own ranks. Overconfidence had been replaced by its dark mirror, stubborn denial. Instead of adjusting, officers clung even more desperately to flawed assumptions. They doubled down on risky strategies, ignoring signs that their early victories had made them predictable to an opponent adapting faster than they were. This was the noise, the internal distortion that drowns out wisdom. There is an obscure diary kept by a young intelligence officer named Masao Abe, discovered decades later in a cedar trunk in his family home. In one entry, dated shortly after Midway, Abe describes a meeting in which Yamamoto tried to shift the fleet's strategy. He urged caution, adaptability, unpredictability, but his warnings were met with forced optimism. The room, Abe wrote, felt like a place where truth was unwelcome. Every man preferred the comfort of yesterday's illusion. This is the essence of overconfidence. It does not merely blind, it anesthetizes. It dulls the senses. It convinces capable minds that the world will remain in the shape that once favored them. Yamamoto watched this unfold with increasing despair, realizing that his officers believed in a version of the war that no longer existed. Noise, emotional, political, psychological, muddied the clarity required for survival. Sun Tzu wrote that clarity is the beginning of victory. But he also warned that the mind becomes clouded not by danger, but by the echoes of past triumphs. When the spirit is swollen, he said, the eyes grow narrow. Yamamoto embodied this warning. His personal vision remained sharp, but he was surrounded by minds narrowed by pride, weighed down by the inertia of their early success. A rare conversation between Yamamoto and Admiral Ugaki captures this tension. The record survives through Ugaki's own diary, now held in a museum in Yamaguchi. Ugaki recounts Yamamoto saying, "We built our strategies for the war we wanted, not the war we are in." It is one of the most penetrating statements ever made about leadership under pressure. It describes not just military failure, but the deeper collapse that occurs when people cling to outdated assumptions. Overconfidence creates a kind of internal gravity. It pulls thought inward, trapping it in past victories. It convinces leaders that the path forward is simply a continuation of the path behind. But the world changes. Opponents learn. Circumstances shift. And the leader who once moved with precision begins to move with echoes instead. Noise disguises itself as confidence. Noise disguises itself as certainty. Noise disguises itself as momentum. In this sense, Yamamoto's story mirrors a psychological phenomenon seen throughout history, one that Sun Tzu warned against again and again. The general who wins too easily mistakes ease for mastery. The general who experiences early success believes he has understood the world. But mastery requires variation. It requires humility. It requires the ability to see beyond the comforting glow of one's own accomplishments. This is where the philosophy takes shape. Overconfidence is not simply an error of judgment. It is a spiritual imbalance. It is the moment when a person stops listening, when intuition is drowned out by applause, when the ego becomes louder than the environment, when the clarity that once guided decisions becomes fogged by expectation. Sun Tzu believed that a commander must remain empty, unburdened by pride, unclouded by past victories, unattached to identity. Yamamoto, for all his brilliance, could not escape the noise around him. His warnings were dismissed. His instincts were muted. His strategies were absorbed into a military structure too rigid to adapt. And so, he became a ghost in his own command, a visionary trapped inside an organization unwilling to see what he saw. But the deeper tragedy lies in what happened next. As the war dragged on, Japanese intelligence began losing the informational advantage. American cryptologists grew more skilled. Code patterns became visible. Messages that were once impenetrable now revealed troop movements and supply routes. In the end, Yamamoto's greatest vulnerability was not a flaw in his thinking. It was the predictability of the communication system that supported him. His final flight was scheduled with a precision that should have been a strength. Instead, it became a beacon for his enemies. When the Americans intercepted his itinerary, they recognized an opportunity that only arises once in a war. Yet the Japanese failed to imagine that such an interception was possible. Their confidence in their encryption was absolute. Too absolute. On the morning of April 18th, Yamamoto boarded a Mitsubishi G4M bomber on what was intended to be a morale tour. He wore his formal uniform, as he always did. Witnesses later described him as serene. Perhaps he sensed the inevitable. Perhaps he had already become the ghost history remembers, a man burdened with clarity in a world clouded by arrogance. American fighters intercepted his plane over Bougainville. The bomber plunged into the jungle, its remains scattered like dark memories across the green canopy. The philosophy behind his death is devastating in its simplicity. Predictability, when paired with overconfidence, becomes fatal. And that leads us into the financial lesson of this chapter, a lesson sharp enough to outlast war, markets, and generations. The same trap that ensnared Yamamoto ensnares investors, entrepreneurs, and decision-makers every day. In the next chunk, we will move from philosophy into finance. We will examine how early success creates invisible traps, how markets punish those who mistake momentum for mastery, and how the subtle noise of confidence can ruin even the most brilliant minds. When Yamamoto's plane fell into the Bougainville jungle, pieces of metal scattered among the ferns and shattered branches. But what truly fractured that day was not steel or bone. It was the illusion of certainty, an illusion that had grown quietly, invisibly, beneath the feet of brilliant men. In the end, his fall became a mirror for every strategist who ever mistook momentum for mastery, for every leader who failed to hear the soft voice of doubt beneath the roar of early success. The financial world is built on this same battlefield. Markets do not merely rise and fall. They punish arrogance. They expose routines. They feast on the predictable confidence of those who believe success guarantees safety. Every decade, every industry, every generation repeats the same tragic pattern. A group of brilliant individuals rises quickly, shines brightly, and then collapses under the weight of assumptions they never questioned. History is littered with Yamamotos in suits, Think of the traders during the dot-com bubble who believed the internet had rewritten the laws of economics. Think of the investment banks in 2008, convinced their mathematical models could tame risk like a domesticated animal. Think of cryptocurrency investors who treated early gains as proof that volatility was a myth. Each of these groups celebrated early victories with the same fervor as the officers who toasted after Pearl Harbor. Each mistook momentum for invincibility. And each was blindsided not by external forces, but by their own predictability. Sun Tzu warned that the moment a general grows proud of his victories, his mind becomes narrow, his strategy rigid, and his perception clouded. Overconfidence is not simply a flaw. It is a structural weakness, as dangerous as marching into an ambush you never believed possible. In finance, this weakness emerges in three predictable forms. The first is emotional momentum. A trader experiences a series of fortunate wins. The profits come easily, sometimes through skill, sometimes through luck, sometimes through a mixture of both. The trader begins to move faster, take larger positions, loosen their risk controls. They speak with more certainty, sleep with less caution, and convince themselves that their success is proof of mastery. Yet what they fail to realize is that their behavior is becoming predictable. Algorithms detect their patterns. More disciplined traders anticipate their aggression. The market begins to move opposite to their expectations, not out of malice, but because predictable actions generate predictable consequences. The second is strategic inertia. A business achieves early success by doing one thing exceptionally well. The founder becomes attached to this method, elevating it from strategy to identity. When markets shift, they hesitate to pivot. When competitors innovate, they refuse to adapt. Their habit becomes their anchor. And like Yamamoto's admirals, they cling to the shape of yesterday's victory, believing the world will bend to their familiar rhythm. It never does. Predictability invites disruption. Rigidity invites irrelevance. The downfall feels sudden, but its seeds were planted in the comfort of early triumph. The third is information blindness. This is the most dangerous form, the silent twin of overconfidence. It occurs when leaders surround themselves with voices that echo their beliefs, when data is interpreted through the lens of expectation rather than fear, when negative indicators are dismissed as anomalies and positive indicators are amplified as validation. Yamamoto recognized this danger vividly. He understood that his nation was ignoring the storm gathering across the Pacific, yet he could not alter the noise around him. Modern organizations suffer from the same affliction. Analysts interpret market trends through the filter of optimism. Startups misread user behavior because it does not align with their vision. Investors cherry-pick data that supports their narrative. They mistake the absence of immediate consequences for the absence of risk. Noise masquerades as truth. This is the trap Sun Tzu described centuries ago. Noise is the enemy of clarity. Noise grows louder after victory. Noise convinces a leader that the path forward has already been paved. And that illusion becomes the opening through which disaster enters. But the financial lesson of Yamamoto's story is not merely cautionary. It reveals a powerful strategy, one capable of turning the vulnerabilities of overconfidence into a shield. The key is to cultivate counter-rhythm. Counter-rhythm is the discipline of disrupting your own patterns before the world does. It is the ability to question success as rigorously as failure. It is the habit of stepping back when everything seems to be accelerating, of listening when others are celebrating, of observing when others are reacting. In the world of investing, counter-rhythm means reducing exposure after a lucky streak, not increasing it. It means diversifying when the market rewards concentration. It means pausing when others are sprinting. In business, counter-rhythm means interrogating your own strengths more often than your weaknesses. It means reinventing products before competitors force your hand. It means changing strategy before the old one becomes a trap. In personal finance, counter-rhythm means resisting lifestyle inflation, maintaining liquidity when others are over-leveraged, and questioning every assumption that early success whispers into your ear. Counter-rhythm is formlessness in motion. It is humility weaponized. It is the strategy Yamamoto tried to embody but could not enforce across the rigid hierarchy around him. There is a haunting passage in one of his private notes, written months before his final mission. "The greatest danger," he said, "is not the enemy before us, but the certainty behind us." Those words distill centuries of strategic wisdom into a single sentence. They reveal that the enemy outside your gates is rarely the one that destroys you. It is the illusion you carry within, and that illusion is always loud. It is always comforting. It is always fatal. The great investors, founders, and strategists of the world share one trait that distinguishes them from those who rise quickly and fall loudly. They do not trust momentum. They do not trust applause. They do not trust victory. They trust only clarity, and clarity requires silence. The silence that Yamamoto sought but could never bring to the minds around him. That silence is where the next opportunity emerges, where the next strategy forms, where the true battlefield becomes visible. With this chapter concluded, we step next into a different kind of power, the hidden economy of alliances shaped not by force, but by whispers. The Venetian merchant families will show how influence, not strength, often determines the true outcomes of conflict. If you walk through the narrow alleys of Venice at night, you can feel the echo of wealth in the air. Not the loud wealth of modern cities, where skyscrapers compete with each other for attention, but a quiet, deliberate wealth that moves like a shadow across the water. Long before banks became global institutions, before markets had tickers and screens, Venice had already built an empire held together not by armies, but by whispers. It is easy to romanticize Venice for its beauty, but beneath the shimmering canals and elegant facades lived some of the most strategic minds ever to shape the flow of commerce. They were not kings. They were not generals. They were merchants, but merchants who understood war better than the soldiers who defended their city. Their battlefield was information. Their weapon was silence. Their alliances were invisible threads stretching from Alexandria to Constantinople, from the Levant to the markets of Northern Europe. Among these families, one name appears frequently in the archives, though rarely in school books: the Contarini. a family so deeply embedded in the political and commercial veins of Venice that over 8 centuries they produced 8 doges and countless advisors, financiers and diplomats. Their influence did not roar. It murmured. It drifted behind closed doors, carried by men who walked with the calm assurance of people who had shaped outcomes long before the city voted on them. One of the lesser-known Contarinis, Niccolo Contarini, left behind a diary now held in a fragile private collection in Padua. The pages are stained with humidity, the ink fading in places, but one passage remains hauntingly clear. He wrote, "True power is the hand that leaves no fingerprints. If they see your intention, they will resist it. If they do not see it, they will call it fate." This sentence captures the heart of Venetian strategy. Power concealed itself. Influence moved quietly. Decisions were shaped by conversations that never appeared in public records. A deal was made not at the bargaining table, but on a gondola gliding under a moonlit bridge. 2 merchants would speak softly, never raising their voices. Yet by the time they parted, the price of spices in Constantinople might shift, or the route of a major trade convoy might change by a few miles, enough to alter the fortunes of entire regions. Venice thrived because its merchants understood that visibility invites attack. If a rival could see your plans, they could anticipate your move, counter it, or poison it. Venice had survived too many wars to ignore this truth. The merchants created a culture in which silence was not only acceptable, it was expected. A man who spoke too openly was considered dangerous, not because he might betray secrets, but because he did not understand the terrain. There is a rumor, preserved in the writings of a 17th century historian named Carlo Ridolfi, that the Contarinis once manipulated an entire regional economy with a single gesture. They quietly purchased grain shipments from the Dalmatian coast, not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to tighten supply. They waited. They allowed the market to grow restless. Then they sold the grain back during a minor drought, doubling their profit while appearing to be benefactors rather than manipulators. No documents prove this, but the rumor persisted for centuries because it aligned so well with Venetian character. Influence without noise. Gain without confrontation. This is where the philosophical layer emerges. The Venetians lived in alignment with one of Sun Tzu's most subtle teachings. The greatest victories are the ones that no one notices. Power that must be announced is already weakened. Influence that must assert itself has already failed its test. A wise strategist understands that silence is not emptiness. Silence is a form of presence. Venice survived because its leaders operated like shadows on the water, always moving, never graspable. This philosophy is not simply historical. It is a spiritual law. When a person moves quietly, they begin to hear truths drowned out by the noise of the world. They sense intention in others. They notice shifts in opportunity. They recognize danger before it takes shape. Stillness becomes strength. Observing becomes influence. And silence becomes a kind of armor. It is no coincidence that Venice outlasted empires larger than itself. Its armies were not mighty. Its territory was not vast. But its intelligence network, its diplomacy, and its financial discipline were unmatched. Venetian merchants understood something timeless. Conflict avoided is profit preserved. A war not fought is a victory earned. In modern financial systems, the same principle unfolds with different costumes. Private equity deals negotiated far from public view. Joint ventures created quietly before competitors can react. Early-stage investments made without fanfare to avoid driving up valuations. Access deals, partnerships, and informal alliances that shape markets long before earnings reports are released. This is Venice Reborn, a business that reveals too much of its strategy, invites sabotage. A founder who announces every idea online teaches competitors how to move faster. An investor who telegraphs their positions becomes prey for those who exploit predictable behavior. Silence is not secrecy. Silence is strategic ambiguity. Venice mastered it. In the next chunk, we will dive deeper into the philosophy behind these shadow alliances and see how subtle influence, not brute force, creates the kind of wealth that lasts across generations. When dawn breaks over the Venetian lagoon, the water turns the color of tarnished silver. Gondolas drift with a slow, deliberate grace, and the city's ancient stones seem to breathe with memory. It is in these early hours, before merchants stir and church bells call the city to life, that Venice reveals its oldest lesson. Real power does not rush. Real power moves without creating ripples. Real power flows beneath the surface, shaping outcomes quietly. Among the merchant families who mastered this art, the Contarinis and their rivals, the Morosini, understood that information was not merely useful. It was currency. But there was another family, far less famous in popular history, yet deeply feared within Venetian circles, the Zancani. Their name seldom appears in official documents, but property records, private letters, and scattered testimonies reveal a lineage of financiers and negotiators who operated from the shadows with a sophistication that bordered on the uncanny. A Venetian archivist once described the Zancani as the breath behind the decisions of others. They rarely spoke in council chambers. They seldom sought public office. Yet they possessed influence over trade convoys, diplomatic missions, and even the selection of certain doges. How did they achieve this without armies, without titles, without the kind of visible authority wielded by their rivals? Through quiet alliances. The Zancani family specialized in relationships, not declarations. They mapped the weaknesses and desires of other families with surgical precision. A young diplomat who needed funds for a risky mission. A military captain burdened by debt. A shipbuilder unable to acquire rare timber. The Zancani stepped in silently, offering assistance without demanding repayment, at least not immediately. Their generosity was recorded not in ledgers, but in human obligation. Venice itself depended on this ecosystem of unspoken favors. The Senate may have set laws, but the merchants ensured their survival through networks of quiet reciprocity. In the archives of San Giorgio Maggiore, there is a curious letter written by a Benedictine monk who observed these families during his decades of service. He wrote, "Their favors move like tides. You do not see the moon's pull, but you feel it." The monk understood something profound. The most enduring influence is the influence no one attributes directly. But influence alone was not what made Venice thrive. It was the discipline of concealment. Merchants routinely destroyed drafts of letters, held private meetings in wine cellars, and conducted negotiations through coded phrases exchanged on parchment that could be read only once before burning. A surviving example of such a cipher, a small scrap kept inside a reliquary for centuries, contains nothing but 3 words: "The bridge shifts." Historians still debate its meaning. Some believe it referred to a dock where goods could be exchanged discreetly. Others think it meant that an alliance had changed hands. The true meaning is lost, but the intention behind such secrecy is clear. In a world where trade routes determined survival, revealing your plans was the first step toward losing your advantage. This is exactly where the philosophy aligns with Sun Tzu. His teachings emphasize that strategy must remain invisible until the moment of action. Visibility invites resistance. Predictability invites attack. But concealment invites opportunity. The Venetians practiced this instinctively. There is a remarkable document from the late 15th century written by a merchant named Lorenzo da Torcello. He described a negotiation between 2 trading houses that occurred entirely through silence. The men stood on opposite sides of a warehouse, examining cargo. They did not exchange a single word. Yet by the time they walked out, both families had agreed to divide the profits of a rare spice shipment. Their gestures, pauses, and glances carried all the meaning necessary. They communicated through the subtle language of competitors who understood that speaking openly was a liability. The philosophy here is simple. When your voice is quiet, every word carries weight. When your intentions are hidden, every move becomes unpredictable. Stillness is not passivity. Stillness is leverage. This silent mastery created an economy that operated in parallel to visible trade. While ships traveled across the Mediterranean carrying goods, invisible agreements shaped prices long before the vessels arrived. The Venetians developed a habit of influencing external markets indirectly through internal coordination. A single letter sent to a contact in Alexandria could shift the cost of pepper across Europe. A whispered agreement in a tavern near the Rialto could redirect a fleet away from danger. Their world was a web where each thread carried the tension of countless unseen forces. Modern markets operate in much the same way. Behind every public announcement, there are private negotiations. Behind every financial surge, there are silent signals exchanged among institutions. Behind every corporate partnership, there are months of quiet conversation unknown to the public. This is Venice reimagined, a corporation that moves quietly, protects its advantage. A founder who shares less attracts fewer strategic predators. An investor who avoids broadcasting his positions becomes immune to psychological manipulation. Silence becomes a moat. Ambiguity becomes armor. Private alliances become the engines that generate outsized returns. Yet the Venetians teach something even deeper. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is the presence of intention. Their alliances endured because they were built on 2 principles: long memory and mutual benefit. A merchant who accepted a favor understood that repayment would come years later, perhaps in an unexpected form. A diplomat who shared a rumor recognized that the same network might one day shield him from scandal. These relationships were not written in contracts, but in trust reinforced by time. Trust became the currency that outlasted war. In the next chunk, we will step directly into the financial application of these lessons. We will explore how shadow alliances translate into modern strategies, how quiet negotiation becomes a weapon, and how invisible influence yields the kind of wealth that resists both competition and chaos. When we speak of Venice's hidden alliances, we are not discussing mere history. We are describing the blueprint behind modern financial dominance. The same principles that governed the Contarini, the Morosini, and the elusive Zancani govern mergers, venture capital networks, international trade agreements, and the quiet handshakes that determine the fate of global markets. Venice is not gone. It lives in every boardroom, every private equity dinner, every discreet partnership whispered between two powerful people behind closed doors. To understand how Venice's shadow economy translates into modern finance, we must first look at the nature of their alliances. Venetian merchants understood that formal agreements were fragile. Contracts could be broken. Decrees could be overturned. Public treaties could be exploited by rivals. But private alliances, rooted in personal loyalty, obligation, and shared interest, could endure storms that no written document could survive. This is why they invested in relationships long before they invested in goods. Modern finance operates under a similar truth. Access is the strongest currency in the world. Access to information, access to capital, access to decision makers, access to opportunities not yet visible to the crowd. In this sense, the Venetians were the world's first architects of what we now call insider advantage. But let us be clear, the power they wielded was not the corruption that modern audiences associate with the word insider. It was something far more sophisticated. They cultivated networks the way a gardener cultivates rare trees, slowly, patiently, with attention to the unseen roots rather than the visible branches. A Venetian merchant might spend years developing a relationship with a distant trader in Alexandria, offering small favors with no expectation of immediate return. A shipbuilder might quietly secure a promise from a mayor in Dalmatia to ensure first access to timber during harsh winters. A diplomat might send a small gift to a family in Crete every year, knowing that such gestures create obligations that no law can enforce, but no honorable merchant would ever ignore. These gestures formed a network of loyalty so intricate that historians still struggle to chart it. There is a letter preserved in the private library of the Chigi family in Rome, written by a Venetian merchant to his son in the early 1500s. It contains a simple line that distills the entire Venetian ethos. Gold moves markets. Friendship moves empires. This is the financial lesson at the heart of Venice's shadow economy. Wealth follows relationships. The deeper the relationships, the smoother the flow. Influence is not a display of strength. It is the ability to move quietly through worlds that others cannot enter. In modern business, we see this mirrored everywhere. A startup founder may raise capital not because of the quality of the product, but because a mentor whispers the right name in the right ear. A CEO might secure a life-changing acquisition over a private lunch where no minutes are recorded. A hedge fund may succeed because it receives subtle hints about a shift in regulations before they become public. None of this appears on balance sheets. None of it is announced. Yet each moment shapes vast movements of capital and opportunity. This is why ambitious people who rely solely on brute effort often lose to those who cultivate strategic relationships. Hard work builds skill. Relationships build leverage. But there is a deeper layer to Venetian strategy that transforms silence from a defensive tactic into a generative one. Venetian merchants mastered the art of selective invisibility. Selective invisibility is the practice of revealing just enough to appear harmless while concealing the full extent of your strategy. The Venetians were notorious for acting weaker than they were. They allowed rivals to underestimate them. They cloaked their ambitions behind gestures of humility. They rarely displayed wealth publicly, not because they lacked it, but because they understood something crucial. Envy is a form of attack. When people envy you, they begin plotting against you. When they underestimate you, they leave you alone. When they need you, they protect you. This is the triad of power the Venetians perfected. Selective invisibility protects your position. Selective generosity expands your influence. Selective alliances create your future. This strategy has powerful applications in finance. A company that reveals its long-term roadmap too early invites competitors to react. A founder who flaunts success invites scrutiny and sabotage. An investor who shares their thesis publicly becomes the target of counter moves. Quietness becomes a moat. Subtlety becomes survival. Ambiguity becomes advantage. But silence is not enough on its own. Venice also mastered anticipatory alliances, relationships built in anticipation of future conditions, not present ones. This is what allowed them to survive wars that crushed stronger kingdoms. While others formed alliances in reaction to danger, Venice built them decades earlier, long before the danger existed. This is the difference between reacting and designing. In the world of wealth, the greatest fortunes are built not by reacting to crises, but by preparing for circumstances that most people never imagine. Consider investors who built their positions before technological shifts, before political changes, before supply chain disruptions. Their success appears prophetic, but it is strategy, not prophecy. They saw the world not as it was, but as it was becoming. Venetians understood this instinctively. They studied regions, tracked rumors, watched shifts in power with the patience of astronomers observing the stars. They built alliances in silence because they wanted to shape the future, not chase it. This is how a small city-state with limited territory gained control of entire trade routes. The financial application is direct and powerful. Build alliances before you need them. Expand your network before a crisis arrives. Strengthen your position before competition awakens. Prepare quietly so you do not need to react loudly. What Venice teaches us is that the greatest power is the power no one notices. The wealth that lasts is the wealth protected by silence. The influence that endures is the influence woven through relationships that cannot be undone. Before the world carried glowing screens in every pocket, before we learned to measure our days by notifications and messages, there was a company that shaped the rhythm of global communication with an authority so absolute that its fall still feels like a myth. Nokia was not merely a brand. It was a kingdom built not on swords or spices, but on engineering excellence and a quiet confidence that seemed unshakable. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Nokia stood atop the world. Their phones were in every hand, every bag, every taxi, every distant village where technology was still a stranger. In some countries, the word phone itself became synonymous with Nokia. It was trusted with a devotion rarely seen in modern markets. Their devices were nearly indestructible, their batteries lasted for days, and their reputation carried an aura of inevitability, as though the company had discovered a formula for permanence that no competitor could unravel. But permanence is an illusion, and illusions, when held too tightly, become traps. Nokia's origins were far humbler than the empire it eventually became. It began in the dense forests of Finland in the 1800s as a small pulp mill near the Nokianvirta River. The company moved through industries like a traveler, changing landscapes, rubber, cables, electronics, constantly reshaping itself in response to necessity. This adaptability became its early strength. When the world shifted toward telecommunications, Nokia shifted with it. When the mobile revolution began, Nokia sprinted ahead, becoming the unexpected champion of a technological age. Yet buried within this success, like a seed waiting for the right season, lay the conditions of its collapse. One of the most revealing internal documents, leaked years after the downfall, described Nokia's culture at its peak as a place where engineers spoke in absolutes. Decisions were often final before they were examined. Hierarchy weighed heavily on conversations. Meetings resembled ceremonies where subordinates nodded and executives spoke with the confidence of men who believed they were shaping the future. A Finnish journalist once described Nokia's headquarters as a cathedral of certainty. It was meant as admiration. In retrospect, it reads like a warning. Inside those walls, something subtle began to shift. The company's leaders started trusting their past more than the present. They believed that their dominance was proof of invulnerability. They believed that their brand was too strong to be challenged. Most dangerously, they believed that their customers would never abandon them. This psychology mirrors the downfall of great empires. Success creates comfort. Comfort creates rigidity. Rigidity invites new forces to reshape the world. There is a curious, lesser-known story told by a former engineer who worked in the R&D division during Nokia's golden age. He recalled an internal meeting where a team presented a prototype touchscreen device years before the iPhone existed. The device was rough, experimental, and ahead of its time. The executives listened politely, then dismissed it. Touchscreens, they believed, were a novelty. Consumers would prefer the reliability of physical buttons. The idea was shelved. The engineer later kept the prototype in a drawer at home, a ghost of a future Nokia refused to imagine. This single moment captures the tension at the heart of the company's collapse. Innovation was not stifled by lack of talent. Nokia had some of the brightest minds in the world. Innovation was stifled by fear. Fear of changing a model that had worked so well. Fear of cannibalizing their own products. Fear of deviating from the shape of yesterday's success. And so, Nokia began to harden. As competitors experimented boldly, Nokia refined safely. As the world shifted toward software-driven ecosystems, Nokia doubled down on hardware. As Apple and Google explored new ways of thinking about mobile experience, Nokia remained anchored to its past, believing that quality alone would protect it. The industry moved like water. Nokia stood like stone. A senior executive, years after the collapse, confessed in an interview that the company had lost the art of listening. They listened to their own echoes instead of the world. They listened to their past instead of their future. They listened to their fear instead of their instinct. This brings us to the philosophical core of the chapter. Sun Tzu taught that rigidity is death. The world is a shifting landscape. Strategies must be alive. A structure that cannot bend will eventually collapse under its own weight. Water survives because it adapts. It takes the shape of its environment. It flows around obstacles. It never insists that the world must remain as it was yesterday. Nokia forgot how to be water. Its systems became rigid. Its culture became cautious. Its assumptions became immovable. And that rigidity made it vulnerable to a competitor whose strength lay not in hardware brilliance, but in willingness to reimagine the entire idea of a mobile device. That competitor was Apple. But before the iPhone delivered the symbolic blow, Nokia was already silently cracking. The iPhone was not the cause of their collapse. It was the spark that revealed the dry landscape beneath. The financial lesson here begins to take shape. It is not merely about markets. It is about the internal mindset that determines whether a person, company, or investor thrives or falls. Rigidity destroys not because the world is cruel, but because the world is fluid. Those who cling to old forms drown in new conditions. In the next chunk, we will go deeper into the philosophy behind adaptability, exploring how ego, fear, and cultural inertia brought Nokia to its knees, and how flexibility, humility, and reinvention are the modern equivalents of Sun Tzu's principle of shaping oneself to the terrain. After Nokia reached the peak of its dominance, a strange tension began to seep into the company's internal culture. It was not dramatic. It was not obvious. It did not announce itself with conflict or scandal. It crept in quietly, like frost forming on a window during a long winter night. Engineers noticed it first. They sensed that innovation, once encouraged with enthusiasm, now carried a subtle risk. Management wanted progress, but only progress that did not disturb the familiar shape of Nokia's success. Innovation had to fit within boundaries drawn by past victories. This is always the first symptom of rigidity. The past becomes sacred. A series of internal interviews conducted years after the collapse reveals something remarkable. Many engineers warned Nokia's leadership about the rapid shift toward mobile internet and the rising importance of software ecosystems. They presented concepts, prototypes, and forecasts that predicted exactly what Apple and Google would later dominate. Yet their warnings were gently waved away. Leaders believed that their quality, brand strength, and global reach were enough to maintain supremacy. They trusted their legacy more than the landscape. This is the psychological trap that Sun Tzu warned about centuries ago. When a general begins to fight today's battles with yesterday's strategy, defeat is already seated. One former senior developer described a moment that has since become infamous within tech circles. He recalled demonstrating an early smartphone concept that featured a strikingly advanced touch interface. It was clunky, but it worked. Instead of excitement, he was met with discomfort. One executive reportedly said, "This is brilliant, but it will disrupt our best-selling models." The innovation was shelved. The engineer later said it felt like watching the future die on the table. This was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern. Nokia's leadership had developed a belief, almost a superstition, that their keypad-based phones were the identity of the brand. They feared that abandoning the keypad would alienate customers. They feared that touchscreen technology could not match the reliability of their designs. They feared that embracing new systems would dilute the perfection they had achieved. Fear disguised itself as prudence. Caution disguised itself as wisdom. Rigidity disguised itself as stability. Sun Tzu wrote that terrain never remains the same, and a commander who fails to adapt will be defeated by the terrain itself. Nokia faced a technological landscape that was shifting beneath their feet, but they treated it as if it were stable ground. Another internal story speaks volumes. In the early 2000s, Nokia held a closed meeting where several teams discussed the growing threat posed by emerging smartphone platforms. A small group proposed developing a unified operating system that could evolve to meet future demands. But the proposal was blocked because the company feared the transition period would reduce short-term profits. When asked why they avoided such a bold move, one executive reportedly said, "We cannot risk uncertainty when we are winning." Winning. Always the most dangerous moment. This is the same trap that destroyed Yamamoto's command, the same trap that doomed Li Guang on the Silk Road. When success becomes identity, adaptation feels like betrayal. When momentum becomes comfort, change feels like punishment. But the world has no sympathy for comfort. As Apple prepared the iPhone, Nokia's internal structure became increasingly fragmented. Teams competed rather than collaborated. Departments hoarded resources. Engineers feared challenging senior management. The once fluid company began to resemble a rigid fortress, strong on the outside, brittle within. Meanwhile, the market was shifting with the silent force of a tide. Consumers wanted apps, not buttons. They wanted internet access, not menus. They wanted simplicity, not complexity. Apple understood this intuitively. Google understood it with cold precision. Nokia did not understand it at all, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked adaptability. The most telling moment came shortly after the iPhone launched. Nokia's leadership dismissed it publicly, calling it a niche luxury product that would not threaten mainstream markets. They believed people would always value durability over experience. They believed their brand loyalty was unbreakable. They believed their dominance was protected by the past. But markets do not honor belief. Markets honor relevance. Within 2 years, the cracks spread. Within 5 years, the empire collapsed. The philosophical lesson here emerges with sharp clarity. Rigidity is not merely a failure to adapt. It is a spiritual resistance to reality. Sun Tzu taught that the warrior must shape himself to the terrain, not demand that the terrain shape itself to him. Flexibility is not weakness. It is survival. The world rewards those who move with the current, not those who cling to the riverbank. Nokia became a monument to its own legacy. It stopped listening. It stopped flowing. It stopped questioning itself. And so, when change came, it shattered instead of bending. Now, we approach the financial application of this story. The collapse of Nokia is not just a lesson for corporations. It is a mirror for anyone navigating a world defined by uncertainty. Adaptability determines wealth. Rigidity determines ruin. Whether in investing, entrepreneurship, or career growth, the principle remains the same. The moment you stop evolving, the world begins evolving without you. In the next chunk, we will break down the financial strategies that emerge from Nokia's downfall, the methods modern strategists use to stay fluid, avoid rigidity, and position themselves so that every shift in the landscape becomes an opportunity rather than a threat. When Nokia finally saw its empire crumble, the world reacted with disbelief. How could a company that once commanded 40% of the global mobile market fall so quickly, so silently, and so completely? Analysts searched for complex explanations. Consumers blamed the arrival of the iPhone. Executives blamed internal politics. Commentators blamed cultural differences between Finnish engineers and American software visionaries. But beneath all these explanations lay a single truth that Sun Tzu would have recognized instantly. Nokia did not lose to Apple. Nokia lost to the terrain. And in the world of strategy, the terrain is always changing. The terrain changed when phones ceased to be tools and became ecosystems. The terrain changed when software became more valuable than hardware. The terrain changed when users wanted experiences, not features. But Nokia did not change with it. This brings us to the financial heart of the chapter: how rigidity destroys wealth and how adaptability preserves and multiplies it. The first financial principle reflected in Nokia's collapse is the danger of path dependence. This occurs when an individual or organization becomes so defined by earlier successes that every future decision is filtered through that identity. Path dependence convinces traders to stick with outdated strategies. It convinces professionals to stay in declining industries. It convinces investors to hold companies long after their competitive edge is gone. And it convinces corporations to cling to products that the world has already abandoned. Nokia became dependent on its own success. And success hardened into dogma. Path dependence breeds complacency, and complacency breeds obsolescence. Investors who once believed in newspaper stocks held their positions long after the internet made print irrelevant. Companies that dominated retail collapsed when they resisted e-commerce. Skilled professionals who refused to update their expertise found their careers dissolving beneath their feet. In each case, the terrain changed, and rigidity masked the danger until it was too late. This leads to the second principle: innovation as defense. Many people mistake innovation as a competitive tool. But the most powerful purpose of innovation is protection. It protects relevance. It protects position. It protects longevity. Companies that innovate defensively stay ahead of inevitable shifts. Amazon did not innovate out of excitement. It innovated out of fear, fear that someone else could disrupt them the way they disrupted others. Jeff Bezos famously told his teams that he wanted Amazon to be terrified every morning. This is the opposite of Nokia's mindset. Nokia acted as though the world owed them deference. They believed their past victories insulated them from future risks, but the world owes nothing to those who do not evolve. The third financial principle revealed by Nokia's collapse is one of the most powerful in modern strategy: the compounding effect of early adaptation. Adaptation works like interest. The earlier you do it, the greater its benefits. Companies that pivot early gain market share, while competitors cling to old models. Investors who shift before trends explode capture exponential returns. Professionals who retrain before their roles become obsolete carve out new opportunities, while others scramble to catch up. This is why the greatest fortunes are built by people who respond to small shifts, not by those who react to obvious ones. By the time a shift becomes obvious, the advantage is already lost. Nokia dismissed small signals. Apple embraced them. Google studied them. Samsung capitalized on them. And the compounding effect of those early adjustments reshaped the global market. Sun Tzu would describe this phenomenon through the metaphor of water. Water anticipates gravity. It does not wait for the rock to fall. It flows around obstacles effortlessly because it moves with sensitivity to the slightest change in direction. The strategist who wants to thrive must cultivate this sensitivity, not searching for dramatic events, but noticing subtle shifts before they grow teeth. The fourth principle is perhaps the most personal. Ego is expensive. Ego convinces companies that they cannot fail. It convinces investors that they cannot lose. It convinces executives that markets will bend to their preferences. Ego blinds people to reality. It muffles warnings. It elevates self-image above truth. A leaked internal report revealed that Nokia's executives, even as their market share eroded rapidly, believed they could reverse the trend simply by accelerating production of familiar models. They wanted the world to return to the terrain they knew. But terrain does not negotiate. It does not slow down. It does not comfort those who hesitate. In finance, ego is the most reliable destroyer of wealth. Traders blow up accounts because they refuse to accept small losses. Entrepreneurs sink resources into failing products because their pride cannot tolerate defeat. Investors ignore obvious red flags because acknowledging them would mean admitting their judgment was flawed. Ego blinds. Humility illuminates. Sun Tzu wrote that a general must remain empty so that new information can enter. Nokia was full of pride, full of assumptions, full of attachment to its own myth. And so, when reality knocked, there was no space left for truth to enter. The fifth and final principle emerging from Nokia's downfall is the importance of strategic reinvention. Reinvention is not merely changing direction. It is the decision to abandon former identities in pursuit of future relevance. Very few organizations or individuals have the courage to do this. It requires letting go of the comfort of the past. It requires stepping onto terrain that feels uncertain. Reinvention is the opposite of rigidity. Reinvention is choosing discomfort over decay. Reinvention is the strategy that turns threats into beginnings. After their collapse, Nokia did something extraordinary. They reinvented themselves once more. They returned to their roots, networks, infrastructure, invisible systems that make modern communication possible. They abandoned their image as a phone maker and became one of the world's leading providers of telecom technology. Their phones vanished, but the company did not die. It simply shifted shape. It learned, at last, to flow again. This story reveals the truth beneath Sun Tzu's teachings. Flexibility is the ultimate advantage. Rigidity destroys, but reinvention restores. Chapter 5 closes with a simple, timeless truth. The world changes faster than certainty. The wise adapt faster than the world. From here, we turn toward a far darker lesson in strategy, the Great Tokyo Raid, a tragedy amplified by unpreparedness, misplaced confidence, and failure to anticipate predictable danger. The night of March 9th, 1945, began like any other in wartime Tokyo. Dim streets, shuttered windows, the distant hum of factories sustaining an empire stretched thin. Yet beneath the quiet routine lay an unease that had been building for years, an unease that government officials refused to acknowledge and civilians could not escape. The city had grown faster than common sense could keep up with. Homes built of wood and paper crowded narrow districts like tinder, waiting for a careless spark. The same materials that once symbolized simplicity and beauty had become a silent vulnerability. Tokyo was a capital unprepared for the war it found itself in. Japan had transformed itself into an industrial force, but its cities, deeply rooted in tradition, lagged behind. Bureaucrats insisted that air raids would be minimal. Architects warned that the wooden neighborhoods posed catastrophic risks, but their warnings were seen as pessimism. A handful of engineers attempted to raise concerns about infrastructure weaknesses, fire breaks, water access, and evacuation plans, yet their voices drifted into the political wind, drowned out by leaders who clung to hope disguised as strategy. And so, the city continued to grow in the only way it knew: tightly packed, flammable, vulnerable. On that March night, the vulnerability became fatal. An American bomber fleet approached the city, flying lower than any raid before it. Their weapons were not high explosives, but incendiaries, clusters designed to ignite, scatter, and consume air itself. When the first bombs fell, they did not explode with thunderous violence. They cracked softly, releasing streams of burning chemicals that slithered across rooftops like molten serpents. Fire did not erupt. It unfolded. It spread with a deliberate hunger, crossing streets with silent speed. Survivor accounts describe a horrifying transformation. The city went from quiet to inferno in minutes. Wind currents stoked the flames until they roared with a force that seemed supernatural. Entire neighborhoods became rivers of fire. People ran toward canals, only to find the heat so intense that the water itself began to boil. Families clung to bridges, watching flames swallow everything familiar. The sky glowed orange, then red, then black with smoke so thick that daylight hours later would feel like dusk. The scale of destruction was beyond comprehension. More than 100,000 people died. 1 million lost their homes. It remains, even now, one of the single deadliest air raids in human history. Yet the tragedy did not arise solely from the attack. It arose from unpreparedness, an unwillingness to acknowledge vulnerability, a refusal to adapt, a belief that danger could be ignored until it passed. Sun Tzu wrote that the wise commander avoids what is strong and strikes at what is weak. The American planners studied Tokyo and saw weakness everywhere. Dry wood, narrow streets, insufficient fire breaks, limited water pressure, overconfidence, denial. Tokyo's leaders built an empire, but left the heart of their capital exposed. There is an obscure document recorded by a young civil engineer named Takashi Mori, discovered decades later in a bundle of personal papers. Mori had submitted a report 3 years before the raid, detailing precise vulnerabilities that a determined enemy could exploit. He noted specific districts where fires could spread uncontrollably, where wind patterns could accelerate destruction, where evacuation routes would bottleneck. His report was quietly filed away. One senior official reportedly told him, "You worry too much. Japan will never see a firestorm." This kind of certainty, unearned, unchecked, and unexamined, is always a prelude to disaster. The most painful irony is that Tokyo's vulnerabilities were not hidden. They were obvious to anyone willing to look. But leaders often ignore the very dangers that require courage to acknowledge. And when danger is ignored long enough, it grows teeth. That night, Sun Tzu's teachings echoed across a burning city. Strength is not always visible. Weakness is not always subtle. And the greatest threats are often the ones we already know, but choose not to prepare for. The raid revealed another uncomfortable truth. Risk does not wait for permission. It does not pause out of courtesy. It attacks when preparation is weakest. As Tokyo burned, men who once dismissed warnings now watched the consequences of their complacency unfold with merciless clarity. The philosophical core of this chapter begins to sharpen in this moment. Unpreparedness is not merely an oversight. It is a form of blindness, a refusal to confront the terrain. A leader who cannot acknowledge risk becomes its first victim. In our world today, the same principle operates in quiet, modern forms. People ignore financial vulnerabilities because they are uncomfortable. Companies dismiss threats because preparation seems expensive. Investors underestimate downturns because they have not felt one recently. Individuals avoid difficult truths because the familiar feels safer than the necessary. But the terrain does not care about comfort. In the next chunk, we will explore the philosophy behind vulnerability, how denial shapes disaster, how preparation shapes survival, and how Sun Tzu's teachings guide us to confront the weaknesses that modern life trains us to avoid. See, as dawn approached after the firestorm, what remained of Tokyo looked less like a city and more like a vast, smoldering plain. Entire districts had been erased. Streets that once carried the footsteps of merchants, children, artisans, and soldiers now lay beneath layers of ash. Survivors wandered in silence, their faces covered in soot, their clothes burned into their skin. What struck many observers was not only the devastation, but the stunned disbelief, a collective realization that what had been destroyed that night was not merely a city, but an illusion, the illusion of safety. Vulnerability that is ignored becomes destiny, and this is where the deeper philosophy behind the Great Tokyo Raid begins to reveal itself with brutal clarity. The tragedy was not simply the result of an overwhelming enemy. It was the inevitable outcome of a city and a leadership unable to confront its own fragility. The weaknesses that led to destruction were not secret. They were well known, whispered among engineers, firefighters, urban planners, and even residents. But civilization has a peculiar habit of assuming that danger will show mercy if we refuse to acknowledge it. Sun Tzu warned that the greatest threat is the threat you convince yourself does not exist. When you are not prepared, you will be captured. He did not mean captured by an enemy. He meant captured by reality. Tokyo had built an empire on discipline and pride, but cities do not survive on pride. They survive on preparation. A scholar from Waseda University once uncovered an internal report from 1942 written by a group of urban planners who pleaded for improved fire breaks, wider streets, and steel reinforcements in high-density districts. Their report was suppressed. One line reads, "The people must not be alarmed. Our defenses are strong." Yet even the city's own fire chiefs knew the truth. They knew a firestorm was possible. They had warned of it repeatedly after studying the destruction of Hamburg and Coventry. Those warnings, like so many before them, were dismissed. Human beings have a universal weakness. We mistake the absence of disaster for the presence of safety. The philosophical lesson here is harsh but necessary. Vulnerability is not created by risk. It is created by denial. The structures that collapse first are always the ones leaders refuse to examine. This pattern repeats across every era, every culture, every domain of power. Whether it is a city ignoring fire hazards, a kingdom ignoring its supply lines, or a company ignoring market disruption, the result is always the same. Unseen threats do not remain unseen forever. They wait. They accumulate. And when they strike with the force of everything we refused to face. Sun Tzu emphasized that a commander must see clearly. Clarity requires humility. It requires the courage to acknowledge weakness without flinching. The leaders of Tokyo were talented, devoted, and patriotic. But they lacked the one quality that could have saved the city, the willingness to examine the painful truth staring them in the face. The deeper tragedy of March 9th is that the city's destruction was not solely the result of military attack. It was the natural consequence of a fragile system, allowed to remain fragile for too long. This same dynamic operates in our lives today. Consider a person who refuses to examine their finances, who avoids opening bills, who ignores the slow accumulation of debt. Disaster does not strike suddenly. It grows quietly, fueled by avoidance. Then one day, everything collapses, and it seems sudden only because the person refused to see it forming. Consider an investor who holds a failing asset out of stubbornness. They convince themselves the downturn is temporary. They avoid studying the reasons for decline. They cling to hope instead of strategy. When losses become catastrophic, they blame external forces. But the real cause was unpreparedness. Consider a company that ignores an emerging competitor, believing its loyal customers will never leave. Leaders cling to tradition. They underestimate the speed of change. They dismiss early signs. When disruption arrives, it appears like a lightning strike, but the clouds had been gathering for years. Vulnerability always begins in blindness. Preparedness always begins in awareness. Tokyo had warnings. It had the opportunity to prepare. It had the expertise and the knowledge. What it lacked was flexibility, the ability to change when change was necessary. This is the same rigidity that doomed Nokia, the same overconfidence that doomed Yamamoto, the same predictability that doomed Li Guang. The philosophical thread connecting all these stories is unmistakable. Survival is not the reward of strength. It is the reward of awareness. Strength without awareness is brittle. Strength without humility is doomed. In one of Sun Tzu's most profound but often overlooked lines, he wrote, "Protect yourself against defeat before seeking victory." He understood that the foundation of power is defensive. To be unassailable is to be prepared. To be prepared is to see what others refuse to see. Tokyo did not fail from lack of bravery. It failed from lack of preparation. And this brings us to the modern financial application of the Great Tokyo Raid, how individuals, businesses, and investors can protect themselves from catastrophic losses, not through aggression, but through foresight. Night in the Central Asian steppe is a vast and unforgiving silence. The wind drags across the plains like a long breath of history, carrying with it the scent of dust, old battles, and the faint whisper of hooves that once shook the earth. Before Europe had awakened to the idea of global trade, before the world understood what intelligence networks could accomplish, the Mongol Empire had already woven a web across continents, a lattice of information so sophisticated, so quietly efficient, that it remains one of the least understood achievements in the history of strategy. Most people imagine the Mongols as a force of brute conquest, unstoppable horsemen storming across the world. But that image hides the real engine of their empire. The Mongols did not conquer the world by strength alone. They conquered it through information. It began with a system known as the yam, a word meaning checkpoint or relay. But in truth, the yam was far more than a relay system. It was a nervous system stretched across the body of a growing empire. Every 20 to 30 miles, a station stood ready with fresh horses, shelter, supplies, and guards. Couriers traveling at impossible speeds carried messages, intelligence, maps, warnings, and secrets. A single document could cross an area the size of Europe in mere days. Communications that would take other empires weeks or months moved through the Mongol network like lightning draped over the earth. But the yam was only the visible layer of something deeper. Hidden beneath it was the Urtok system, merchant financiers who doubled as intelligence collectors. These weren't traditional spies. They were businessmen who ran caravans, traded goods, and embedded themselves in foreign markets. While selling silk or metalwork, they gathered information about city defenses, political tensions, trade routes, religious disputes, and the economic pulse of entire regions. To outsiders, they were merchants. To the Mongol leadership, they were the eyes and ears of empire. The least known layer of this network, however, comes from a small set of Persian manuscripts discovered in the 19th century in Herat. In those pages, a scribe described a secret group referred to only as the Whisper Men. These operatives were neither soldiers nor merchants. They were linguists, translators, and wanderers who moved between borders disguised as holy men, beggars, or storytellers. They learned local gossip, monitored travelers, and sometimes altered the flow of rumor to weaken alliances before the Mongols ever arrived. Their existence is rarely mentioned in mainstream histories, yet they embody the most mysterious and sophisticated principle of Mongol strategy. Control information, and you control the future. The most gripping story from this shadow network occurs in the build-up to the Mongol invasion of Khwarezmia. When Genghis Khan sent envoys to negotiate trade rights, the Shah of Khwarezm received advice from ministers who assured him that reports of Mongol strength were exaggerated. They had heard nothing threatening from their informants. They believed the Mongols were merely a nuisance tribe from the east, unruly but insignificant. What they did not know was that the Whisper Men had already altered the flow of information within the region. They spread harmless rumors of Mongol poverty, internal disputes, and weak leadership. They fed these stories into the markets, the mosques, and the courts. A merchant in Bukhara later wrote that he heard nothing but tales of quarrels and emptiness from the east, stories that made the Shah dismiss the Mongols as little more than nomads begging for trade. And when the Mongols finally attacked, the Shah realized too late that he had been living inside an illusion someone else crafted. This is where the philosophy beneath the Mongol network emerges like a blade in moonlight. The Mongols believed that information was like water. If you guided its flow, you shaped the world. They did not rely on brute force to conquer cities. They relied on knowledge gathered long before the first arrow flew. Before they marched, they already knew which gates were weak, which factions hated each other, which generals could be bribed, which elite families had rivals willing to betray them. Brute force broke cities. Information broke empires. Sun Tzu's teachings echo perfectly here. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. The Mongols practiced this with astonishing precision. Entire regions surrendered before battle because they believed resistance was hopeless. Entire cities opened gates because they were convinced Mongol forces were far larger than they actually were. Entire kingdoms collapsed under pressure that began not on the battlefield, but in rumor, fear, misdirection, and the silent movement of information. The Mongols mastered the art of shaping perception long before conflict began. And here we reach the financial resonance of the story. The modern world is built on information warfare just as surely as the Mongol Empire was. Markets rise and fall on expectations, not realities. Companies win or lose based on intelligence, not brute effort. Investors succeed not by reacting to news, but by understanding its flow, how it spreads, where it originates, and whose interests it serves. Information is the currency that determines advantage. In the next chunk, we will unravel the philosophy that made the Mongol system invincible, how they perceived information as terrain, how they shaped narratives, and how they used invisibility as a strategic weapon. We will explore the metaphysics of intelligence gathering, the spiritual posture of clarity, emptiness, and attunement that Sun Tzu quietly hints at across his writings. Then, in the final chunk of this part, we will translate all of this into financial strategy, building information networks, reading the unseen, identifying hidden intent, using informational asymmetry the way the Mongols used the yam, protecting insider knowledge the way empires protect their borders. A vast empire cannot survive on force alone. Swords dull, horses tire, generals falter. But information, when cultivated with patience and precision, remains sharp long after armies disperse. The Mongols understood this with an instinct that seemed almost supernatural, though it was nothing more than ruthless clarity. In the Mongol worldview, knowledge was not an accessory to power. Knowledge was power. They viewed information as a living river flowing beneath events. To command that river was to command the movement of destiny. The Mongols were nomads by heritage, trained from childhood to read the land, the sky, the wind, and the behavior of animals. This sensitivity to subtle signs translated seamlessly into their military and political strategy. While other empires built walls, the Mongols built routes. While others trusted fortifications, the Mongols trusted intelligence. And while others waited for envoys to bring news, the Mongols created networks that ensured news arrived before events even unfolded. This philosophy crystallized most clearly under Ögedei Khan, Genghis Khan's son, who expanded the Yam system into the most efficient communication network the world had seen. He believed that an empire is a living organism, and its longevity depends on the speed at which it senses danger. He is recorded in one Persian chronicle as saying, "The empire dies the day it cannot feel its own edges." The yam allowed the empire to feel everything. A Mongol commander on the western border could warn Karakorum about an uprising or invasion within days. Economic information, grain shortages, merchant disputes, taxation concerns traveled just as quickly. The speed was not merely a convenience. It was the foundation of empire-wide coherence. No other power of the era possessed anything remotely comparable. Yet the Mongols' brilliance lay not just in collecting information, but in interpreting it. They understood that information itself is neutral. It becomes powerful only in the hands of those who can read its quieter implications. For example, there is a lesser-known incident recorded in Rashid al-Din's Compendium of Chronicles. A Mongol officer reported that a minor city in Khorasan had suddenly begun importing large quantities of grain months before harvest season. Most would see this as preparation for famine. The Mongols saw it differently. They recognized it as a sign that local leaders were preparing to support hidden militias. The increased grain stores were meant to feed soldiers during an uprising. The rebellion was crushed before it began. This is the essence of Mongol interpretation. They listened not only to what was said, but to what was missing. Not only to facts, but to patterns. Not only to movement, but to intention. Their intelligence agents, Both official couriers and unofficial whispermen moved through markets, taverns, and caravanserais with patient attention. They asked questions that sounded innocent. They observed reactions that revealed more than answers. They became masters of extracting meaning from silence. One fascinating anecdote comes from a Chinese merchant who traveled through Samarkand. He described encountering Mongol operatives disguised as tea sellers who asked travelers about road conditions, regional prices, and rumors of new alliances. These questions appeared harmless, but each one mapped the economic and political temperature of the region with exceptional accuracy. The Mongols possessed something Sun Tzu praised relentlessly: the ability to see the invisible. Sun Tzu wrote that the greatest commanders perceive the formless. To understand the formless is to understand the future. To understand the future is to win before fighting. This philosophical core explains why the Mongols often achieved victory with minimal resistance. By the time their armies approached a city, they already knew everything that mattered. They knew which factions hated the ruling class. They knew which gates were weak. They knew which advisors could be bribed. They knew how many loyal soldiers would stand their ground and how many would flee. Entire cities surrendered not because the Mongols were unstoppable, but because the Mongols knew exactly where their cracks were. That is the heart of the Mongol shadow network. Information was not collected. Information was sculpted. The Mongols shaped how others perceived them. They encouraged rumors of invincibility because they understood that fear was a weapon sharper than steel. Stories spread of Mongols who could ride for 10 days without rest, of soldiers who could drink the blood of their horses, of armies that materialized from thin air. Some of these legends had truth. Many did not. But they were not corrected. They were cultivated. The Mongols created their own myth, and people surrendered to the myth before surrendering to the army. This deliberate manipulation of perception has a clear philosophical parallel in Sun Tzu's teachings. Appear strong when you are weak. Appear weak when you are strong. But the Mongols perfected it beyond deception. They transformed perception into reality. They allowed fear to paralyze enemies long before a battle began. Yet the Mongols also understood something deeper, something bordering on spiritual. They believed that a leader must remain empty to perceive truth. The Mongol commanders were known for their ability to absorb information without ego. A junior scout could question a general. A courier could challenge a strategy. The Mongol system valued clarity over hierarchy. In this way, they resembled the fluidity of water, moving around obstacles, reshaping itself, never rigid. Contrast this with the Japanese hierarchy that ignored Yamamoto's warnings, or the Nokia executives who dismissed their engineers. The Mongols listened to the lowest-ranked members of their system because they understood that insight does not follow rank. Now, the philosophical lesson of this chapter emerges fully. Information is not merely collected. It is cultivated. It is interpreted. It is weaponized. And it is shared through a structure that values truth over comfort. This leads naturally into the financial application. In the modern world, The most successful individuals and institutions replicate the Mongol strategy. They build information networks. They cultivate relationships that provide signals long before opportunities become obvious. They learn to read markets the way Mongol scouts read the land, by noticing what others ignore. They understand that perception shapes prices, that rumors shape volatility, that timing shapes advantage. The Mongol Empire did not endure because of brute force. Armies can only conquer. They cannot sustain. What sustained the Mongols, what allowed them to expand across continents with an efficiency that confounded every civilization they encountered, was their mastery of information. At its core, their empire was not a military machine. It was an intelligence machine. And in the modern world, this ancient machinery has become the architecture of financial dominance. To understand how, we must translate the Mongols' principles into the language of markets, strategy, and wealth building. The parallels are so precise that they feel almost uncanny. The first financial law we draw from the Mongols is this: information advantage compounds faster than capital. Modern markets celebrate capital, money, credit, leverage. But the true catalysts of wealth are information networks, much like the yam stations that moved messages at impossible speeds. The investors who consistently beat markets are not the ones who rely on public announcements, headlines, or quarterly reports. They are the ones who gather information before price reflects it. Not insider trading, not illegal knowledge, but relational intelligence. This intelligence emerges from conversations, relationships, private indicators, early data, shifts in consumer behavior that only the attentive notice. It emerges from being in rooms where future trends are quietly discussed years before the world catches on. The Mongols would call this standing on the ridge before the wind changes. The second financial law is: information is useless without interpretation. Just as Mongol operatives interpreted grain imports as signs of rebellion, successful investors interpret market signals through patterns, not noise. For example, a sudden spike in hiring at a small tech company might seem trivial, but to a perceptive mind, it could reveal an impending product release, a strategic pivot, or an acquisition target. A decline in shipping container orders can predict macroeconomic slowdown months before analysts publish warnings. A new regulatory filing in a remote jurisdiction can reveal corporate restructuring invisible to the public. The Mongols mastered what Sun Tzu called the skill of discerning the hidden. Modern financial mastery demands the same. The third law is deeply psychological. Silence protects your edge. Venetian merchants concealed strategy. Zhuge Liang cloaked intention. Mongol commanders guarded information with the vigilance of a dragon protecting treasure. In finance, discretion is not secrecy. It is survival. A trader who broadcasts their strategy becomes predictable prey. A founder who unveils their roadmap invites competitors. An investor who reveals their thesis too early drives prices against themselves. The Mongols built an empire by revealing only what they wanted others to believe. The modern strategist must do the same. The fourth law we inherit from this empire is perhaps the most powerful. Build alliances before you need them. The Mongols' Urtok merchant network, financiers embedded across Asia, was not built in response to crisis. It was built in anticipation of possibility. These merchants created relationships with local communities decades before the Mongol army arrived. When the time came, they provided intelligence, supplies, diplomacy, and invisible support. Successful modern wealth builders behave the same way. They develop relationships before opportunities emerge. They cultivate trust long before they need capital, introductions, or influence. They understand that the most valuable resource in finance is not money, but access. Access to people, information, decisions, and opportunities hidden from the public. In markets, as in empire building, opportunities do not come to those who knock loudly. They come to those whom others quietly trust. The fifth law, drawn directly from Sun Tzu's invisible teachings, is a spiritual discipline. Stay empty so you can see clearly. The Mongols listened to scouts, merchants, envoys, and low-ranking soldiers. They allowed truth to flow upward. Their commanders possessed a psychological flexibility that most modern institutions lack. In finance, emptiness means clarity. Clarify your biases. Remove ego. Detach from predictions. Remain receptive to new data. Investors lose fortunes when they grow attached to their own narratives. Leaders destroy companies when they dismiss unwelcome truths. The empty mind sees shifts early. The rigid mind sees them only after collapse. The final law of the Mongol network is the most formidable. The one who shapes narrative shapes reality. The Mongols weaponized myth, stories of invincibility, tales of unstoppable advance. These stories weakened cities before soldiers arrived. The same dynamic unfolds in markets. Narratives move prices. Narratives pull capital. Narratives shape perception, and perception shapes action. A company becomes a unicorn because investors believe it will. A currency collapses because markets believe it might. A stock rises because the story surrounding it becomes irresistible. A project fails when the public loses faith before results arrive. The Mongols understood that whoever controls the story controls the battlefield. In our world, the story is the battlefield. And here lies the deepest financial truth Sun Tzu whispered across centuries. Control information, and you do not need to control people. Control perception, and you do not need to control events. Control narrative, and you win without fighting. This chapter ends with a single question. The question that defined the Mongol strategy and defines modern wealth. Are you reacting to information or shaping it? If you react, you are a soldier on the field. If you shape, you become the general. If you shape quietly, invisibly, through relationships and clarity, you become something far more powerful. The person who wins before others realize a contest has begun. The next chapter, Chapter 8, will guide us into the epilogue, how to put down the sword, how to leave the battlefield with wisdom rather than wounds, and how to turn these lessons into a lifelong way of being. There is a moment at the end of every long journey when the world feels strangely quiet. The battles behind you fade into memory. The strategies sharpen into lessons. And what once felt urgent now feels distant, softened by time. as you sit here, beside this imagined fire, listening to the old stories settle into your mind like falling ash, the truth begins to reveal itself. Everything you have learned in this long exploration, the Silk Road ambush, the fires of Red Cliff, the ghost of Yamamoto, the Venetian shadows, the collapse of Nokia, the burning of Tokyo, the Mongol web of intelligence, has been pointing toward one thing: not conflict, not dominance, not victory at any cost, but clarity. Clarity is the final weapon. Clarity is the final refuge. Clarity is the final peace. Sun Tzu never intended the art of war to be a manual for constant conflict. He intended it as a mirror. When you read the old text carefully, you begin to see that his true battlefield was human perception. His true enemy was confusion. His true victory was the moment when a person understood the terrain so clearly that battle became unnecessary. In every story we explored, the downfall came not from weakness, but from blindness. Li Guang died because he moved inside a pattern he could not see. Cao Cao burned because he trusted what he expected, not what existed. Yamamoto fell because success had deafened those around him. Nokia collapsed because they clung to the past. Tokyo burned because its leaders denied the obvious. And empires struggled because they misunderstood the invisible rivers of information. The question these stories leave behind is simple, but profound. What do you refuse to see? What terrain in your life have you left unexamined? What vulnerability have you dismissed because it feels uncomfortable? What rigidity have you protected because it feels familiar? What old success are you still clinging to, long after the world has changed? When you lay down the sword, you are not surrendering. You are doing something far more powerful. You are choosing perception over reaction. You are choosing design over desperation. You are choosing mastery over exhaustion. This is the moment when strength becomes quiet. There is a legend from the final years of Sun Tzu's life. It has little historical proof, yet it carries the weight of truth. It is said that after decades of advising kings, studying war and shaping armies, he retired to a small house near a riverbank. Villagers often saw him walking slowly at sunrise, hands behind his back, listening to the water. When a young soldier once approached him asking for guidance in becoming a great warrior, Sun Tzu replied only, "First, learn to be still. The rest will reveal itself." That is the heart of this journey. Stillness allows you to see the patterns around you. Stillness allows you to hear the intentions of others. Stillness allows you to notice the shifting terrain. Stillness allows you to understand where you should move and where you should not. We live in a world of constant noise, notifications, deadlines, expectations, market movements, competition, the relentless pulse of a society intoxicated with urgency. And yet, the stories of history show us again and again that the ones who rise above the noise are the ones who step outside of it. The strategist who observes instead of reacts. The investor who waits instead of panics. The leader who studies instead of boasting. The individual who understands that calmness itself is a form of power. There is one last insight to leave with you, one that belongs not to Sun Tzu, nor to emperors, nor to generals, but to the old merchants of Venice. It was written in the diary of Niccolo Contarini, the man whose voice guided us through the shadows of Chapter 4. He wrote, "Those who chase wealth lose it. Those who study the winds find what others are chasing." If you understand the winds, timing information, vulnerability, rigidity, perception, and human nature, then wealth becomes a consequence, not a pursuit. That is the true meaning of winning without fighting. You do not overpower the world. You move with it. As this long night of stories draws to a close, imagine the fire before you softening into embers, the smoke rising slowly into the dark, history settling around you like a blanket. Let the lessons breathe inside you. Let them break down the noise that has followed you through your life. Let them become part of your intuition, your judgment, your stillness. You are no longer a participant in someone else's war. You are the designer of your own terrain. And the world will move differently beneath your feet because of it. If you are ready, we may now enter the final section, a gentle descent into sleep programming and affirmation, where these teachings will be softened into quiet truths that your mind can absorb naturally. Settle into the darkness now. Let your breath soften. Let the weight of the day dissolve, like mist leaving the surface of a quiet river at dawn. You have traveled far tonight, through deserts, cities, empires, shadows, victories and ruins. Now you return to yourself. Now you return to the quiet place where clarity begins. There is no more battle. There is no more urgency. There is only you and the slow drift of your breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, gentle, unforced, like water finding its own path. Tonight you will sleep in alignment with wisdom older than language. Tonight you will let these teachings sink beneath thought, into the calm places where intuition lives. Your body grows heavier. Your mind grows lighter. You float between waking and dreaming, like the hush before sunrise. The stories you heard tonight carried lessons, but they also carried something deeper: the rhythm of history, the patience of time, the quiet power of stillness. You are safe here. You are guided here. You are held by the warmth of understanding. Let the voice at the fire continue. There is a river within you, a river that remembers, a river that carries everything you have learned tonight. This river does not rush. It does not struggle. It does not fight the stones in its path. It flows around them. It reshapes them. It takes the shape of the world as it is, not as it used to be. As you breathe, feel that river moving inside you. Quiet, steady, endless. This is the nature of true strength. Effortless, calm, certain. Relax your shoulders. Relax your jaw. Let tension melt from your hands. Let your chest loosen. Let your breath fall into a slow, natural rhythm. You are learning the way of water. Tonight, you will absorb the lessons that matter most, not through effort, not through conscious study, but through rest. The mind learns deeply when it is quiet. The heart understands clearly when it is soft. The inner strategist awakens when you stop trying to force direction. Let these truths drift into you, gently. I walk through life with clarity. I see the terrain before I step onto it. I am calm in uncertainty. I adapt with confidence. I move like water. Let them echo softly inside you, like distant waves. I recognize danger early. I protect my peace. I protect my resources. I protect my opportunities. Feel the truth in these words. Not loud, not urgent, just present. You are becoming the person who sees the invisible currents beneath events. You are becoming the person who cannot be blindsided. You are becoming the person who wins without fighting. As you drift deeper, imagine the fire before you fading into warm embers. Their glow soft, their heat steady, their crackle reduced to a faint whisper, a companion to your breath. You sit in quiet mastery now, a peaceful strategist, a calm observer, a person aligned with truth. Repeat softly in your mind, I am aware, I am adaptable, I am prepared. And again, slower. I am aware, I am adaptable, I am prepared. Let the rhythm become a lullaby. The lessons of tonight are no longer stories. They are part of you now. They live inside your intuition, your instincts, your inner stillness. You will carry them tomorrow without effort. You will feel clearer without trying. You will move differently, not rushed, not pressured, not reactive, but steady, centered, awake. Now, breathe deeper. Let the breath fall all the way into your belly. Let your ribs loosen. Let your spine soften. You are safe. You are supported. You are learning even now. Repeat gently, I choose clarity. I choose patience. I choose stillness. I choose wisdom. Each repetition is a thread weaving calm into your body. Let the stories of Li Guang, Zhuge Liang, Yamamoto, the Venetian merchants, the rise and fall of Nokia, the burning of Tokyo, and the Mongol network settle into a single truth. You are not at war anymore. You are not chasing. You are not struggling. You are seeing. Imagine yourself standing by a vast, moonlit lake. The water is perfectly still. No wind. No waves. Only reflection. The moon glows on the surface like a silver coin, and the lake holds the shape of the world without resistance. This is your mind now. Clear, quiet, reflective, honest. You may whisper, nothing can overwhelm me. Nothing can rush me. Nothing can confuse me. I see things as they are. Breathe. The lake remains still. You remain still. Nothing can disturb you. Drift deeper into the warmth of sleep now. Each breath draws you further from noise, further from tension, further from old patterns that no longer serve you. You do not need to fight tomorrow. You need only see it. You do not need to push. You need only align. You do not need to fear uncertainty. You need only remain fluid. You are water. Finally, you are clarity. You are calm strength. Let yourself fall now, gently, slowly, into a long night of healing sleep. You are safe. You are resting. You are becoming. And as you drift off, one last truth settles into the center of your being. The world cannot hinder the one who moves like water. Sleep now. You have learned enough for tonight. The fire will guard you until morning.